Hello there. Come on in. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're going to talk about a story that so many of us know by heart. A story of slippers and scarecrows, of courage and home. But inside that familiar, beloved tale, there is a hidden story, a history that is far more complex and far more real than any witch or wizard. It's a story that begins in a field of impossible color, under a spell of gentle, deadly sleep. It's the story of a flower. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. If you enjoy what we do here, this quiet exploration of the natural world, do consider liking the video or perhaps subscribing. It's a small, silent gesture that helps our little community grow, and I always love to hear from you. I'd be so curious to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It's a beautiful thought, all of us, scattered across the globe, settling in to listen to the same story together. But that's enough of that. The most important thing now is for you to get ready for rest. Dim the lights. Adjust your pillow until it's just right. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it go. Let the weight of the day settle and then release. We are about to travel somewhere else. We're going to shrink down, not to the size of an ant or a beetle, but to the size of a single memory. A scene from a film that has been playing in the back of our collective minds for generations. Let's step quietly into that frame and see what we can find. Chapter 1. The Land of Oz and the Treachery of a Flower. There are moments in filmmaking that become more than just scenes. They become part of our cultural language. Images so potent they feel like our own memories. The moment Dorothy and her friends arrive at the poppy field outside the Emerald City is one of those moments. It is a masterpiece of artifice, a spectacle of pure, unadulterated technicolor. After the sepia tones of Kansas, after the vibrant but earthy tones of Munchkin Land and the dark woods, this field is an explosion. It's a sea of impossible red, a crimson so deep and uniform it feels less like a product of nature and more like a thought, an emotion made visible. The flowers are enormous, their petals like tissue paper, their centers a dark, mysterious black. They stretch on and on, a silent, beautiful ocean lapping at the very gates of a dream. The music shifts. It becomes gentle, ethereal, a lullaby played on celestial strings. It's not overtly threatening at first. It's seductive. It promises rest. It whispers of peace. And for Dorothy, a girl who has been through so much, a girl so very far from home, the promise of rest is an irresistible siren song. She runs into the field, laughing, the cowardly lion bounding beside her. The scent, we are told, is overwhelming, a sweet, soporific perfume that hangs heavy in the air. And then, the spell begins its work. Dorothy's laughter fades, her steps slow, a yawn escapes her lips. "I'm so sleepy," she murmurs, her voice thick with a strange, magical fatigue. She sinks to the ground, her eyes closing, a gentle smile on her face as she drifts into a profound, unnatural slumber, the Tin Man and Scarecrow looking on in helpless panic. The lion too succumbs, his mighty form collapsing amongst the scarlet blooms. It is a perfect fairy tale threat. It is beautiful, silent, and deadly. There is no monster, no overt violence. The danger comes from the land itself, from nature bewitched and turned against our heroes. The solution, too, is pure fantasy. Glinda, the good witch, conjures a gentle snowfall, the pure white flakes counteracting the poppy's spell, washing the air clean and allowing the friends to awaken, unharmed and unaware of how close they came to sleeping forever. It's a moment of peril, resolved with a wave of a wand. And for most of us, that's where the story ends. The poppies of Oz are a magical flower, a narrative device, a beautiful obstacle on the yellow brick road. But what if we were to pause here, in this field of cinematic crimson? What if we were to look closer at these flowers and ask a different kind of question? Not, how does the magic work? But rather, why this flower? Why, out of all the fantastical plants a writer could invent, did L. Frank Baum, writing his book in the year 1900, choose the poppy as his agent of enchanted sleep? And why did that choice still resonate so powerfully with audiences in 1939, when the film was made? To answer that, we have to let the Technicolor dream fade away. We have to step out of the land of Oz and into the world that created it. Because the flower at the heart of this scene is very, very real. Its scientific name is Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. Somniferum, from the Latin, it means the sleep-bearing. And for thousands of years, long before Baum ever put pen to paper, humanity has understood its power. It is a flower of profound duality, a source of immense relief from pain, and a source of immense suffering and addiction. And in the America of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this duality was not a distant, abstract concept. It was a quiet, intimate, and deeply complicated part of everyday life. Let's first look at the real plant. The poppy of Oz is a caricature, a single monolithic red. The real Papaver somniferum is far more varied, far more subtle in its beauty. It grows in delicate shades of white, of pale pink, of deep lilac and velvety purple. Its petals are impossibly thin, like crumpled silk, emerging from a green bud that nods on its slender stem as if heavy with secrets. The plant itself is unassuming, elegant. It asks for little. It can grow in poor soil, a quiet and resilient survivor. But the real power, the story of this plant, is not in its petals. The petals are a fleeting display, a brief and beautiful advertisement to pollinators. After they have served their purpose, they fall away, drifting to the ground like discarded confetti, and what they leave behind is the heart of the matter, a pale green globular seed pod. Botanists call it a capsule. It's smooth, waxy, and crowned with a small star-like stigma that gives it the appearance of a tiny regal scepter. It is, in its own way, a perfect piece of natural architecture, a secure vault, and inside this vault, nature, acting as the most brilliant and patient of chemists, has been at work. If you were to take a sharp tool and make a shallow, careful incision in the skin of this green pod while it is still unripe, something remarkable would happen. From the cut, a thick, milky white liquid would begin to ooze, like tears. This is the plant's latex, its lifeblood, and its defense. Exposed to the air, this latex quickly oxidizes, thickening and turning a dark brownish black, the color of hardened resin. This substance is the plant's chemical shield, evolved over millennia to deter insects and grazing animals who might try to eat its precious seeds. To a small creature, this latex is a potent, bitter poison, but to the complex neurochemistry of mammals, particularly humans, it is something else entirely. This raw, sticky resin is opium, and it is not one single chemical, but a breathtakingly complex cocktail of organic compounds. Nature is the ultimate frugal engineer. It rarely creates a complex molecule for just one purpose. Within this single substance there are dozens of different alkaloids, each with its own unique shape and its own unique way of interacting with the biology of another creature. Among them are compounds like noscapine, which suppresses coughing, and papaverine, which relaxes smooth muscle tissue. And then there are the two most famous, the two titans of its chemical arsenal, codeine, and its far more powerful cousin, morphine. These molecules are shaped by the blind, beautiful accidents of evolution to fit. They are like microscopic keys forged in the green tissues of a plant that happen to fit perfectly into specific locks within the human central nervous system. These locks, known as opioid receptors, are part of our own internal pain management system. When we experience severe injury, our body releases its own natural pain relievers, called endorphins. These endorphins slot into the opioid receptors and tell the brain to dial down the pain signals, to create a feeling of calm, even euphoria. It's the system that allows a wounded animal to escape a predator, or a human to endure a terrible accident. The alkaloids in the poppy latex are masters of mimicry. Morphine, in particular, is a near-perfect counterfeit of our own endorphins. When it enters the bloodstream, it races to the brain and begins to fit into those same locks, but it does so with a power and a persistence that our natural chemicals cannot match. It doesn't just dial down the pain, it can turn it off completely. It floods the system, creating a wave of profound tranquility, a warm, blissful sense of detachment from all worldly cares and discomforts. It is this incredible power, the power to grant relief from the most profound physical suffering, that has made the poppy one of the most significant plants in all of human history. But to understand its place in Dorothy's story, we must zoom in on a very specific time. Let's set our clock for the year 1900, the year The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was first published. Imagine the world L. Frank Baum lived in. It was a world crackling with new inventions, telephones, automobiles, electric lights, but medicine was in a strange transitional phase. The germ theory of disease was still relatively new and not universally accepted. There were no antibiotics. A simple infection from a cut could be a death sentence. Surgery was a brutal, terrifying ordeal. and chronic pain, from arthritis, from neuralgia, from injuries sustained in the Civil War, which was still a living memory for many, was a constant, grinding companion for millions of people. In this world, the doctor's black bag held very few true cures. What it held, primarily, were treatments for symptoms, and the most powerful symptom reliever of all was opium. It was available in countless forms. There was raw opium, which could be smoked. There was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, a bitter, reddish-brown liquid that was a staple in almost every home. And in 1804, a young German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner had managed to isolate the most active principle of opium. He named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. By the late 19th century, with the invention of the hypodermic syringe, pure injectable morphine was widely available to physicians. It was hailed as a miracle, a gift from God. But the story goes deeper than the doctor's office. It goes to the general store, the traveling salesman's wagon, the pages of every newspaper and magazine. This was the golden age of the patent medicine industry. To call it an industry is almost an understatement. It was a cultural phenomenon. In an era before federal regulation, before the Food and Drug Administration, anyone could mix up a concoction in their backyard, give it a catchy name, bottle it, and sell it to the public as a cure for anything and everything. And they did. The advertisements from this era are a window into a world of profound hope and profound vulnerability. There were bitters to cure liver ailments, sarsaparillas to purify the blood, and tonics to restore vitality. The language of these ads was one of comfort and reassurance. They featured images of smiling grandmothers, robust men, and most disturbingly, healthy cherubic babies. And the secret ingredient in a vast number of these wildly popular remedies was opium, or one of its derivatives. Ayer's cherry pectoral, for coughs and colds, contained morphine. Perry Davis's painkiller, a household name for decades, was a mixture of opium and alcohol. These were not fringe products. They were the equivalent of our modern-day aspirin or cold medicine. They were ubiquitous. A bottle of laudanum could be purchased from a mail-order catalogue as easily as a pair of boots. And this brings us to the most poignant and unsettling corner of this history, and the one that casts the longest shadow over that field of poppies in Oz. It concerns the quietest members of society, the infants and young children. Teething was a terrifying time for parents. The constant crying, the fever, the seeming agony of their child was a source of immense distress. Colic, coughs, fussiness. These were daily battles in households that were often crowded, loud, and lacking the comforts we take for granted. And into this environment of desperation came a salvation, sold in a bottle. It was called soothing syrup, and the most famous of them all was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The advertisements proclaimed it was for children teething, and showed beatific images of mothers tenderly administering the syrup to their calm, happy infants. It was, the ads promised, like a mother's hug in a bottle. It worked like a charm. A few drops on the gums or mixed with a little water, and a screaming, inconsolable baby would quiet down, their fists unclenching, their face relaxing into a deep, peaceful slumber. For an exhausted, overwrought mother, perhaps with several other children to care for and a household to run, it must have felt like an absolute miracle. A moment of silence, a moment of peace. The active ingredient in Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was morphine. A single bottle contained enough of the powerful narcotic to kill a small child. And all across America and Britain, for decades, mothers, with the best and most loving of intentions, were unknowingly dosing their children with a potent opiate. They were calming their babies by inducing a narcotic stupor. The syrups were so common, they were sometimes referred to as baby killers. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high in this era, and while poor sanitation and disease were the primary culprits, it's impossible to know how many sudden, unexplained deaths in the cradle were the result of an accidental overdose of soothing syrup. Newspapers would occasionally run tragic stories of children found dead in their beds, an empty bottle of syrup on the nightstand beside them. Yet the products remained on the shelves, their popularity barely dented. This was the world that L. Frank Baum knew, a world where the poppy's gift of sleep was not a fantasy. It was a household commodity. It was in the medicine cabinet. It was in the nursery. It was a substance used to quiet the fussy, to soothe the sick, to ease the pain of the old, and to calm the crying of the very, very young. It was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of life, and yet its true nature was deeply misunderstood. Addiction was seen not as a physiological dependency, but as a moral failure, a weakness of character. The term dope fiend was just beginning to enter the lexicon, but it was applied to the shadowy figures in opium dens in Chinatown, not to the respectable housewife who relied on her daily dose of laudanum for her nerves, or the decorated Civil War veteran with his morphine syringe. Society was saturated with opiates, but it was in a state of profound denial about their consequences. So now, let's return to that field outside the Emerald City. Dorothy, a child, is overcome by an irresistible urge to sleep. Her friends are powerless to stop her. She sinks into a beautiful, deadly trap, a slumber from which she may never awaken. Is it possible that Baum, in creating this scene, was simply reaching for a convenient trope? The ancient association of the poppy with sleep and death goes back to the Greeks and Romans. Perhaps it was nothing more than that. Or perhaps it was something more. Perhaps Baum, a man of his time, was tapping into a deeper, unspoken anxiety. He was writing a story for children, in an age when children were being routinely drugged into silence with the very essence of that same flower. The image of a child, lost and vulnerable, falling into a drugged sleep from which she needs a magical intervention to be rescued. It's hard not to see a parallel. It is a fairy tale reflection of a grim reality. The poppy field in Oz is a place where the promise of peace becomes a threat of oblivion. It is beautiful on the surface, but its perfume is a poison. This is a perfect metaphor for the patent medicine bottle on the nightstand. It promised comfort, relief, a mother's love, but its contents could steal a child's life away. Baum never explicitly stated this connection, of course. It would have been far too dark for a children's story. But sometimes the most powerful truths in a story are the ones that are not spoken aloud, the ones that resonate in the background, like a half-remembered tune. The treachery of the poppy field lies in its seductive beauty, the same seductive promise of peace that filled the pages of newspapers and the shelves of general stores all across the country. Now let's move the clock forward. Let's travel from 1900 to 1939, the year the iconic MGM film was released. The world had changed dramatically. The horrors of World War I, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, a whole lifetime had passed. And society's relationship with the poppy had changed too. The age of innocence, if it ever truly existed, was over. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 had dealt a massive blow to the patent medicine industry. For the first time, manufacturers were required to list their ingredients on the label. Suddenly, the public could see, in stark black and white, that their favorite nerve tonic was mostly alcohol, and that Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained morphine. The curtain had been pulled back. Then came the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, the first major federal attempt to control the distribution of opiates and cocaine. These drugs were no longer available over the counter. They were now controlled substances, their sale and use pushed to the margins of society, into the realm of the criminal and the illicit. By 1939, the public perception of narcotics was radically different from what it had been in Baum's day. The image was no longer the respectable housewife with her laudanum. It was the gaunt, desperate dope fiend, a dangerous social outcast. The propaganda films of the era, like Reefer Madness, portrayed drug users as violent, insane monsters. The comforting, motherly hug of Mrs. Winslow had been replaced by the menace of the back-alley drug pusher. And yet, when Hollywood decided to adapt Baum's book, they kept the poppy field, but they filtered it through the lens of their own time. In the film, the poppy field is not just a natural phenomenon, it is an act of deliberate malevolence. We see the Wicked Witch of the West, cackling as she commands her flying monkeys. And now, my beauties, something with poison in it, but attractive to the eye, and soothing to the smell. Poppies will put them to sleep. This is a significant change. In the book, the field is simply there, a natural, if dangerous, part of the landscape of Oz. The characters wander into it by accident. In the film, the field is an active trap, a weapon conjured by a villain. The danger is externalized. It is not a subtle, creeping consequence of a common household product, but a direct act of magical warfare. This reflects the 1930s view of narcotics as an outside evil, a foreign contaminant threatening the wholesomeness of American life. Furthermore, the 1939 film was made in the depths of the Great Depression. It was designed, from its first frame to its last, as an act of pure escapism. It was a tonic for a nation weary of breadlines, dust bowls, and economic despair. It offered a world of dazzling color, of clear-cut good and evil, where problems could be solved with friendship, courage, and a little bit of magic. In this context, confronting the real, complex history of opiate use in America would have been unthinkable. It was far safer and far more comforting for the audience to frame the Poppies' danger as a witch's spell. It allows us to feel the thrill of the peril without having to look at its messy, uncomfortable reflection in our own world. The magical snow that saves Dorothy is the perfect Hollywood ending, a simple, clean solution to a problem that in reality has no simple solution at all. And so this one scene becomes a kind of time capsule. It contains within it two different eras, two different ways of seeing the same powerful flower. It holds the quiet, unspoken anxieties of Baum's 1900, an age saturated with opiates it refused to understand. And it holds the escapist fantasies of 1939, an age that had begun to fear the poppy, and so chose to relegate its power to the realm of witches and spells. The real poppy, Papaver somniferum, is neither good nor evil. It is a plant. It is a master chemist, a survivor, a silent witness to human history. It has grown in our gardens and battlefields, in our temples and our back alleys. It has been the source of our greatest relief and the catalyst for our deepest despair. It is a plant that holds up a mirror to us. It forces us to ask questions about our own relationship with pain, with pleasure, with control, and with oblivion. The field of poppies in The Wizard of Oz is the gateway. It is the beautiful, familiar door that leads us into this much older, much more complicated story. It takes a piece of our shared childhood and reveals the hidden layers of history beneath it, reminding us that even in the most fantastical of tales, there are echoes of the real world. The quiet rustle of a poppy petal in the wind can carry more stories than a library of books. We have stood for a while now at the edge of this cinematic field, looking at the world that created it. We've seen how a society's changing views were reflected in the journey of a simple children's story from the page to the screen. But this is just the beginning. The story of our relationship with this flower does not start in the 19th century. To truly understand the poppy, we must travel much, much further back. We must go back to the dawn of civilization itself, to ancient Mesopotamia, to Egypt and Greece, to the very first time a human being looked at this humble flower and understood the profound power locked inside its tiny regal crown. That is a story for another time. For now, just rest, let the images settle, the field of impossible red, the gentle magical snow, the quiet, complicated truth of a real flower. There is no danger here, no spell to be broken. There is only the story and the gentle pull of your own well-deserved sleep. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Milk of Paradise, Antiquity's Gift and Curse. And as you rest, as your own gentle, well-deserved sleep begins to pull at the edges of your awareness, let your mind drift with it. Let it travel not forward but back. Back beyond the yellow brick roads and the cinematic sparkle, back beyond the storybooks and even the written word itself. Let's journey together on the quiet currents of time, to the very cradle of our civilization, to a sun-drenched land nestled between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a land the historians call Mesopotamia, but which to the people who lived there was simply the world. Here, in the fertile crescent, under a haze of heat and the endless blue of the sky, humanity first decided to stay put. We learned to coax life from the soil, to build cities of clay brick that rose like geometric mountains from the flat earth. We learned to write, to etch our thoughts and records onto wet clay tablets in the beautiful angular script of cuneiform. And it is here, in this dawn of human record, that we find the first mention of our flower. Imagine a Sumerian scribe, thousands of years ago. Perhaps it is late in the day. The heat is finally breaking, and the air smells of dust, river water, and baking bread. He holds a stylus made of reed, and before him is a small tablet of soft, damp clay. He is not writing a grand epic or a king's decree. He is making a list, an inventory of the plants grown in the temple gardens, plants of power and purpose. And on this list, he carefully presses the symbols for a particular flower. He does not call it Papaver somniferum. That name is millennia away. He calls it something far more telling, a name that speaks not of sleep, but of its consequence. He calls it Hulgil, the joy plant. Think of that for a moment. Not the pain relief plant, not the sleep bringer, the joy plant. It tells us that from the very beginning, our relationship with this flower was not just about dulling a negative, about subtracting pain. It was about adding a positive. It was about the pursuit of a state of being, a feeling of blissful peace, of a joy so profound it was considered a divine gift, worthy of cultivation in the gardens of the gods. How did they discover it? We can only imagine. There are no records of that first momentous encounter. Perhaps a child, suffering from a raging fever, chewed on a wild poppy head and found a quiet, cool relief. Perhaps a farmer, his back broken from a lifetime of labor, noticed how his goats would grow placid and serene after grazing in a patch of these vibrant, delicate flowers. Or maybe it was a priestess, a shaman, seeking a way to bridge the gap between the mundane world and the world of spirits, who first took a knife to the unripe seed pod. Let's picture that moment of discovery. The flower itself is a fleeting beauty, its petals thin as silk, in shades of white or mauve or a pale, blushing pink, last for only a day or two before they fall away, leaving behind the seed pod. And it is this pod, this small green vessel, that holds the secret. It's a beautiful thing in its own right, shaped like a tiny urn with a fluted crown on top, a little piece of natural royalty. To a curious hand it would feel cool and smooth, waxy to the touch. But what happens if you scratch it? What happens if you take a sharp piece of flint or a shard of obsidian and make a shallow, careful incision into that green skin? Something miraculous happens. The pod weeps. From the shallow cut, a thick white liquid begins to ooze, like milk or like tears. It is the plant's lifeblood, its latex, a defense mechanism designed to seal wounds and deter herbivores. It clings to the pod in a pearlescent bead, and as it meets the air, it begins to change. The pure white slowly deepens to a rich amber, then to a dark sticky brown, hardening into a resin. This is raw opium, and to that first human who dared to taste it, to scrape a little of that bitter, sticky gum onto their finger, the world must have changed forever. The roaring pain of a toothache would have subsided to a distant hum. The gnawing anxiety of a coming famine would have been replaced by a serene calm. The harsh realities of a difficult life would have melted away into a warm, dreamlike state. For them, it was not chemistry, it was magic. It was a direct conversation with a god. They had found a key that could unlock a door out of the prison of pain and suffering. And so they cultivated it. They gave it a name that honored its gift. Hull Gill, the joy plant. They tended to it, harvested its milky tears, and made it a cornerstone of their medicine and their spirituality. The poppy had been invited into the human family. From Mesopotamia, its reputation traveled, carried on the slow, deliberate currents of trade and migration. It found its way south, down the coast of the Mediterranean, into the long, narrow kingdom of Egypt, a civilization utterly captivated by the intricate dance between life, death, and the afterlife. If the Sumerians were the world's first farmers and writers, the ancient Egyptians were its first great chemists and physicians. They were masters of preservation, of medicine, of complex rituals designed to ensure a soul's safe passage into eternity. And in the poppy, they found a powerful ally. Let's travel now to the banks of the Nile. The air is different here. It's thick with the smell of river mud, lotus blossoms, and the 100 spices used in their temples and embalming workshops. Here, the poppy was not just a plant of joy, but a plant of profound utility. We know this because they too wrote it down, not on clay tablets, but on vast, incredible scrolls of papyrus. One of these, the Ebers Papyrus, is one of the oldest and most important medical documents in human history. It dates back to around 1550 BC, but its contents are believed to be copied from texts that are far, far older. Unroll this scroll in your mind. It's over 60 feet long, a continuous sheet of preserved reeds covered in meticulous hieratic script. It is a library of knowledge, a complete guide to Egyptian medicine. It contains hundreds of remedies for everything from digestive trouble to crocodile bites. And nestled among these prescriptions, you will find our poppy. The Egyptians called it shepen, and they used it with incredible sophistication. The Ebers Papyrus describes how to collect the latex from the unripe seed heads, just as the Sumerians did, but it then details how to use it. It was a primary ingredient in analgesics, in painkillers. Imagine an Egyptian physician preparing a remedy. He might take a measure of the dried opium resin and grind it into a powder with a stone mortar and pestle. He would then mix it with other ingredients, perhaps honey to make it palatable, or wine to help dissolve the alkaloids, or herbs like coriander and juniper. This concoction could be given to a woman suffering through a difficult childbirth, or to a stonemason who had crushed his hand while building a temple. But its use wasn't limited to pain. The papyrus speaks of a remedy to quiet a crying child. A mixture containing shepen was given to soothe infants and allow their exhausted parents to rest. It is a detail that feels both shockingly alien and deeply recognizably human. The desire for a quiet night's sleep is as ancient as we are. Of course, they had no concept of dosages in the way we do now. They worked by experience, by tradition passed down from master to apprentice. And undoubtedly sometimes that dose was too high. The sleep it brought was a sleep from which a child might not wake. Even here, in this ancient medical text, we can see the shadow that walks beside the gift. The line between a soothing balm and a fatal poison was always perilously thin. The poppy's influence in Egypt went even deeper than medicine. It was woven into their cosmology. They saw the cycle of the poppy as a reflection of their own beliefs about life and death. The flower blooms, beautiful and brief, then dies away. But it leaves behind the pod, the vessel of seeds that promises new life, and the potent milk that offers a sleep so deep it resembled death itself. For a culture so focused on the journey to the afterlife, this was a powerful symbol. Traces of opium alkaloids have been found in canopic jars, the vessels used to hold the organs of the mummified dead, suggesting it may have played a role in their funerary rites, a final sacrament to ease the soul's transition from this world to the next. From the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia and the fertile banks of the Nile, the story of the poppy travels across the sea. It finds a new home in the rocky islands and sun-drenched coasts of the Aegean, where a new civilization is asking new questions. The Greeks, they were not just concerned with healing the body or preparing for the afterlife. They were obsessed with understanding the very nature of the human condition. They sought to explain the world through logic, through philosophy, and through a pantheon of gods who embodied every facet of human experience, from love and war to wisdom and sleep. And it is here, in ancient Greece, that the poppy becomes an icon. It is no longer just a medicinal plant, it is a divine symbol. Imagine walking through the ruins of a Greek temple. The white marble is warm from the sun. Among the shattered columns and weathered friezes, you might find a statue of a god, his eyes closed in serene repose. In his hand, or woven into a wreath on his head, you would find the unmistakable shape of the opium poppy. This is Hypnos, the god of sleep. He was a gentle, benevolent deity, said to live in a dark cave in the underworld where the sun never shone. The entrance to his cave was filled with poppies and other hypnotic plants. He was the son of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, and the twin brother of another, more fearsome god, Thanatos, the god of death. This relationship is so telling. For the Greeks, sleep and death were brothers, two sides of the same coin. Sleep was a temporary visit to the realm of death, a nightly rehearsal for the final journey, and the poppy, with its power to induce a deep death-like slumber, was their perfect shared emblem. It blurred the line between the two states. It was the key to the domain of Hypnos, but use it too freely, and you would find yourself in the permanent embrace of his brother Thanatos. But the family of night had another child, another deity linked to our flower. This was the son of Hypnos, a god who held dominion not just over sleep itself, but over what happens within it. This was Morpheus, the god of dreams. His name gives us our word morphine. He was a shaper, a creator of visions. He could take on any human form and enter the slumber of mortals, bringing them messages, prophecies, or simply fantastical journeys. The dreams brought on by the poppy's milk were his handiwork. They were vivid, strange, and powerful, and so the poppy became associated not just with the absence of pain or the peace of sleep, but with an entirely different state of consciousness, a journey into the landscape of the mind. This trinity, Hypnos, Thanatos, Morpheus, sleep, death, dreams, shows how deeply the Greeks understood the poppy's complex character. It was a gift from the gods, but a gift that had to be handled with immense respect, for its power touched upon the most profound mysteries of existence. And just as in Egypt, this reverence was matched by a rigorous practical application in the world of medicine. Greek physicians, the fathers of modern medicine, studied the poppy with a new kind of analytical eye. Hippocrates, the legendary doctor for whom the Hippocratic Oath is named, prescribed poppy juice mixed with wine as a potent painkiller and a cure for a host of ailments. He documented its effects, its uses, its dangers, but it was perhaps the Roman physician Galen who became the poppy's greatest champion in the ancient world. Galen was a brilliant, meticulous medical researcher, a doctor to gladiators and emperors. He saw firsthand the horrific injuries of the arena and the chronic illnesses of the Roman elite. He experimented endlessly with opium, preparing it in complex recipes known as theriacs and panaceas. The very word panacea comes from the name of the Greek goddess of universal remedy, and for Galen, opium was the closest thing to a true panacea that existed. He praised it as the most powerful of all the drugs which dull the senses. He used it to treat headaches, vertigo, epilepsy, asthma, coughs, fevers, and melancholy. Under the Romans, the cultivation of the poppy exploded. It was no longer a specialist plant grown in temple gardens, but a major agricultural crop. Fields of poppies, their bright, fragile flowers swaying in the Mediterranean breeze, became a common sight across the empire. The milk of paradise was now available not just to priests and physicians, but to the general populace. Opium was sold in markets, in small cakes or pills, a common household remedy for the aches and pains of daily life. The Roman Empire, in many ways, was an empire whose pain was managed by the poppy. It was the aspirin, the sleeping pill, and the antidepressant of the ancient world, all rolled into one. It was so common, so integrated into the fabric of society, that its dual nature was simply an accepted fact of life. It was a gift, it was a curse, it was both. And as the Roman Empire expanded, so too did the poppy's dominion. Its seeds and the knowledge of its use traveled along the vast, intricate network of roads the Romans built, arteries of commerce and conquest that stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Near East. But even this incredible network was just one part of a much larger, much older system of exchange. The true global journey of the poppy took place on a series of routes that were not paved with stone, but with dust and silk and the footsteps of 1,000,000 camels. This was the Silk Road. Let's leave the familiar world of the Mediterranean and travel east. Picture a caravan setting out from a Roman port city like Antioch. The air is thick with the scent of spices, the braying of donkeys, the babble of a dozen languages. Loaded onto the backs of camels are bolts of linen, fine glassware, and gold, and tucked away, perhaps in a small leather pouch, is a supply of opium resin, and more importantly, a handful of tiny black poppy seeds. Each seed is a universe of potential, a dormant promise of relief and oblivion. The journey is long and arduous. It crosses deserts of searing heat and mountains of bitter cold. The caravan is a slow-moving river of humanity, a fragile thread connecting distant worlds. Along the way, goods are traded. Roman glass might be exchanged for Persian carpets for Indian spices. And at every stop, at every bustling oasis caravanserai, knowledge is exchanged along with the goods. A merchant suffering from a desert fever is given a taste of the opium cake by a fellow traveler. He is astonished by its effect. He trades a bolt of his finest silk not for gold, but for the rest of an opium brick and the story of the flower it comes from. In this way, the poppy moved eastward. It was a quiet passenger on one of history's greatest superhighways. It crossed into Persia, where it was embraced by their own sophisticated medical tradition. The great Persian physicians, like Avicenna in the 11th century, would write about opium in encyclopedic detail, refining its uses and creating new preparations. They called it afyun. The name, like the plant itself, was traveling, changing, morphing as it passed from culture to culture. From Persia, it traveled further, into the vast subcontinent of India. Here it found a culture that had its own long and complex relationship with psychoactive plants, used in spiritual and religious ceremonies for millennia. The poppy was absorbed into this tradition, finding a place in Ayurvedic medicine, and in some regions, becoming a part of social ritual. And from India, the caravans and the sea traders carried it even further east, towards the ultimate destination of the Silk Road, the enigmatic, powerful empire of China. When it first arrived, it was likely as a medicine, another exotic herb from the West, valued for its ability to treat dysentery and other ailments. For centuries, its use was primarily medicinal, a curiosity, a potent but respected drug in the vast Chinese pharmacopoeia. The Chinese would eventually give it a new name, Ya-Pian, a phonetic rendering of the word opium. The stage was being set for a new and far more explosive chapter in the poppy's long history with humanity, but that would not come for many hundreds of years. For now, in the period of antiquity, the relationship was one of a strange symbiotic balance. For thousands of years, From the first Sumerian who etched Hul Gil onto a clay tablet, to the Roman citizen buying an opium pill in the Forum, the poppy was a partner. It was humanity's first and most profound answer to the problem of pain. Pain is a universal constant. It respects no borders, no creed, no station in life. It is the great equalizer. The pain of a king's gout is no different from the pain of a farmer's broken bone. And for millennia, the milky tear of a simple flower was the most effective shield we had against it. It gave us more than just relief. It gave us surgery. Before the poppy, any serious operation was an agonizing torture that the patient was unlikely to survive. With opium, a patient could be put into a stupor, a twilight state where the surgeon's knife was a distant, muted sensation. It allowed medicine to advance. It gave us reprieve. It also gave us a glimpse into the strange landscapes of our own minds. It opened the door for the dreamer, Morpheus, to come visiting. It showed us that the reality we perceive every day is not the only one available to us. It offered an escape, a joy so powerful that it could feel like a visit to paradise. But the ancients were not naive. They lived closer to the bone, closer to the hard realities of life and death than we do. They knew that the poppy's gift came with a heavy price. They saw the lotus eaters, those who in chasing the joy lost all ambition and connection to the world. They knew that the dose that brought sleep could also bring death. They saw its power as a poison, a tool for assassination, or a final desperate escape from a life of suffering. They understood its dual nature in a way that was visceral and immediate. It was life and death, bound together in the resin of a single plant, the milk of paradise and the quiet venom of oblivion. So as we leave the ancient world behind, let's hold this image in our minds, not of a field of deadly flowers from a children's story, but of something far more complex, a plant woven into the very fabric of our history, a constant companion on our long journey. It was present at the birth of cities, in the healing hands of the first doctors, in the rituals of the first priests, and in the quiet moments of relief for countless ordinary people across millennia. It was a source of wonder, a tool of immense practical benefit, and a symbol of the deepest mysteries we have ever contemplated. The story is far from over. The relationship between humans and Papaver somniferum is about to enter a new, more turbulent phase. Science will eventually unlock the flower's secrets, isolating its power into a pure, crystalline form of unimaginable potency. Empires will be built on it, and wars will be fought over it. But all of that comes later. For now, just rest in this ancient understanding, the quiet respect for a plant that could give so much, and take everything. The balance, the wisdom, the awe. Let the caravan of your thoughts slow to a halt. Let the dust settle. There is no danger here. There is only the long, slow, winding story of a flower and the people who learn to listen to its secrets, the quiet, complicated truth of the joy plant, and the gentle, ancient pull of your own well-deserved sleep. Chapter 3. The Empire of Dreams. How Britain Weaponized the Poppy. But the secrets a plant keeps depend entirely on the questions you ask of it. For millennia, humanity had asked the poppy for an end to pain, for a doorway to the divine, for a moment of quiet peace. The answers it gave were always the same, whispered in the ancient language of its alkaloids. It offered a gift, but a gift that demanded respect, a careful balance. But a new kind of question was beginning to be formed, not in the quiet of a healer's hut or a philosopher's garden, but in the cold, clattering accounting houses of an empire that spanned the globe. This question was not about healing, or spirit, or even joy. It was about money. It was about power. And the answer the poppy gave to this new question would unmake one ancient empire and build another. The quiet, complicated truth of the joy plant was about to be rewritten, not with wisdom, but with the ruthless logic of a corporate balance sheet. And so our story, and your journey deeper into rest, moves west. It moves to an island nation in the North Atlantic, a place often damp and grey, a world away from the sun-drenched fields where the poppy thrived. This was Great Britain in the 18th century, an empire flush with newfound industrial power, with a navy that ruled the waves, and with an insatiable, all-consuming, and frankly ruinous obsession. Tea. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend now, but the British thirst for Chinese tea was not a simple preference. It was the engine of the national economy. It was the fuel for the new factories, the comfort in every home, from the grandest drawing rooms of London to the humblest cottage. It was a cultural phenomenon. But this love affair came at a staggering cost. The Chinese, under the Qing dynasty, were masters of a self-sufficient empire. They produced silk, porcelain, and tea of a quality the world had never seen, and they wanted very little in return from the West. They had no need for Britain's heavy woolen cloth or its new mechanical trinkets. What they wanted, the only thing they would reliably accept for their precious tea, was silver. And so began one of the greatest wealth transfers in human history. A river of silver, mined in the Spanish colonies of the New World, flowed across the oceans to Europe, and from there it poured inexorably into China. Ship after ship, laden with silver bullion and Spanish dollars, would arrive in the port of Canton, the single place the emperor permitted foreigners to trade. They would exchange their silver for chests of tea, and the silver would disappear into the vastness of the Chinese treasury, never to be seen again. For Britain, this was more than an economic problem. It was a slow-motion national hemorrhage. Imagine your own household budget. Imagine you have a single essential expense that you adore, perhaps a special coffee or a subscription you can't live without. But the person who sells it to you will only accept cash, and they refuse to buy anything you make or do. Every month, a chunk of your savings leaves, and nothing comes back. At first it's manageable, but over years, over decades, you see your reserves dwindling, your financial strength bleeding away. Now scale that up to the level of an empire. The British were facing a crisis. Their treasury was being drained, their economic future mortgaged, for the sake of a cup of tea. They tried everything. They sent diplomatic missions, like the Macartney Embassy in 1793, laden with gifts showcasing the finest products of the British Industrial Revolution: clocks, telescopes, even a hot air balloon. The hope was to dazzle the Qianlong Emperor, to convince him to open his markets to British goods. The Emperor's response was polite but firm and utterly dismissive. He informed King George III that the Celestial Empire possessed all things in prolific abundance and had no need for the manufacturers of outside barbarians. The message was clear: your silver is welcome, but your goods are not. The river of silver continued to flow east. The empire needed a solution. They needed to find a product, something, anything, that China did not have, but that its people could be made to want, something they would desire so much that they would be willing to pay for it with the very silver Britain so desperately needed to get back. The search for this product became the single most important economic quest of the era, and the answer was not found in a factory or a workshop. It was found in a flower, blooming in the fertile soil of another of Britain's colonial possessions, India. It was found in the milky latex sap of Papaver somniferum, opium. It was a solution of such brutal, cynical genius that it remains breathtaking to this day. It was the perfect product. It was lightweight, high value, and most importantly, addictive. It was a key that could be turned in the lock of Chinese society, a key that would not just stop the flow of silver out of Britain, but reverse it, turning it into a torrent of wealth flowing back into British coffers. And the instrument for this grand, world-altering plan was a peculiar entity, a marvel of the modern age: the Honourable East India Company. To call it a company is a profound understatement. It was a corporate state, a private enterprise that functioned like an empire unto itself. It had its own private army, larger and better equipped than those of most European nations. It had its own navy, its own civil service, and it governed vast territories in India, ruling over millions of people. It was a multinational corporation with the powers of a sovereign government, driven by a single, unwavering purpose: profit for its shareholders. When the company looked at the poppy fields of Bengal, they didn't see a source of medicine or a plant with a rich spiritual history. They saw a crop, they saw an asset, they saw the solution to their China problem, and so they began to systematically take control of its production. This wasn't a casual affair. It was a top-down, vertically integrated monopoly, organized with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. Let's shrink down for a moment and leave the boardrooms of London. Let's travel to the humid, fertile plains of Bengal and Bihar in India. Here, under the relentless sun, the plan took root in the soil itself. The company established opium agencies, vast administrative bodies that controlled every single aspect of poppy cultivation. They designated which lands would be used. They advanced cash to the local farmers, the riots, forcing them into a cycle of debt that bound them to the crop. These farmers were not given a choice. They were often compelled to plough under their fields of rice and other subsistence crops to make way for the endless, uniform rows of poppies. The very land that had fed their families for generations was now repurposed to produce a drug destined to poison the families of a nation on the other side of the sea. Imagine the landscape transforming. A diverse patchwork of greens and golds, the lifeblood of a community, is erased. In its place, for as far as the eye can see, is a single, mesmerizing sea of white, pink, and mauve petals. It must have been beautiful, in a terrible, hypnotic way. 1,000,000 flowers, all nodding their heavy heads in the warm breeze, each one a tiny organic factory working in service of the company. The process was meticulous, an agricultural operation on an industrial scale. Company agents would measure the fields, test the soil, and dictate the precise times for planting. Then the waiting, the slow growth of the pale green stalks, the unfurling of the delicate paper-thin petals, and after the petals fell away, the prize was revealed, the swollen green, unripened seed pod, the pawn's head. This is where the human touch becomes essential. The harvest of opium cannot be mechanized even today. It requires a delicate, practiced hand. At a precise moment in the pod's life cycle, usually in the late afternoon when the sun's heat is less intense, the farmers and their families would move through the fields. They would carry a special tool called a nushta, a small multi-bladed knife. With a flick of the wrist, they would make a series of shallow vertical incisions into the skin of the pod. They had to be perfect, too deep, and the sap would flow too quickly or spoil. Too shallow, and the yield would be poor. And then, overnight, the magic of the plant's biology would perform its work. The poppy, wounded, secretes its latex sap as a defense mechanism. It is the plant's lifeblood, its chemical shield, rich with the alkaloids we've spoken of. The white, milky substance oozes from the tiny cuts and, upon contact with the night air, it begins to coagulate and darken, turning into a thick, sticky brownish-black gum. The next morning, before the sun grew too hot, the workers would return. With a small scoop-like tool called a setower, they would scrape the raw opium from the skin of each and every pod. It was slow, laborious, back-breaking work, repeated day after day. This dark, pungent gum was the raw material of an empire. The collected opium was then taken to the company's vast processing factories, places like the one in Patna. Here, it was a scene of almost unbelievable industry. Hundreds of workers, moving in silent, rhythmic lines, would test the crude opium for purity. They would knead it, dry it on vast racks, and then, most crucially, form it into perfect spheres. Each opium ball, or cake, weighed a precise amount, about 3 pounds. It was then wrapped in a protective skin of poppy petals, glued together with more opium liquid, creating a durable, leathery shell. These were the units of trade, the dark, cannonball-like products that would be packed by the thousand into heavy wooden chests. Everything about this process was standardized, quality-controlled, and logged in ledgers. It was a pharmaceutical operation conducted with the efficiency of a car factory. The British East India Company had become, for all intents and purposes, the largest and most sophisticated drug cartel the world has ever known. But here is where the story takes a turn that reveals the calculated hypocrisy at the heart of the enterprise. The company knew that opium was a banned substance in China. The Jicheng Emperor had issued edicts against its importation and consumption as early as 1799. To openly trade it would be an act of diplomatic aggression, so they created a system of calculated denial, a brilliant and dishonest piece of commercial theatre. The East India Company would produce the opium, process it, package it, and bring it to the port of Calcutta. There they would hold public auctions. They weren't selling the opium to China. Oh no, they were simply selling it, at great profit, to private traders. These were the country traders, a motley collection of British, American, and other European merchants, adventurous and ruthless men who were willing to take the final, illegal step. The company could wash its hands of the affair. Officially, their involvement ended at the auction block in India. They were merely selling a commodity. What the buyers did with it afterwards was, officially, none of their concern. It was a legal fiction that allowed them to reap all of the profits of the drug trade while maintaining a veneer of plausible deniability. It was a masterpiece of corporate sidestepping. These country traders would load the chests of opium onto their ships, and these were not slow, lumbering cargo vessels. They were opium clippers. These were some of the fastest and most beautiful sailing ships ever built. Long, narrow, with sharp bows and an enormous spread of sail, they were designed for one thing: speed. They had to be fast to outrun the monsoon winds and to outrun the Chinese patrol junks that occasionally tried to enforce their emperor's laws. Imagine one of these ships, the Red Rover or the Water Witch, slicing through the waters of the South China Sea, its white sails taut against a blue sky, its hull packed with a cargo designed to bring a nation to its knees. On deck, sailors scan the horizon, while below, in the dark hold, lie thousands of those carefully prepared balls of Bengal opium, each one a small, potent package of poison and profit. Their destination was the coast of southern China, near Canton. But they would not sail into the main harbour. Instead, they would anchor at a place called Linton Island, a barren rock in the Pearl River Delta. This island became the floating headquarters of the entire smuggling operation. Here, the opium clippers would moor alongside stationary, permanently anchored depot ships, effectively floating warehouses. These old hulking vessels were filled to the brim with opium chests. From the mainland, the Chinese smugglers would come. They rowed out in what were called fast crabs or scrambling dragons, long narrow rowboats, powered by dozens of oarsmen designed to be swift and silent. They would pull alongside the floating warehouses, pay for the opium, not with goods but with silver, and load the chests. Then under the cover of darkness, they would row back to the mainland, up the myriad hidden creeks and inlets of the delta, bribing local officials to look the other way. From there, the opium spread like a dye in water, moving through the vast, intricate network of Chinese society. It moved from the coast to the interior, from the ports to the cities, and finally into the quiet, smoky rooms where it would be consumed, the opium dens. Let's pause the grand sweep of history and politics for a moment. Let's push open the door to one of these dens in 19th century Canton. The air inside is thick, heavy and sweet, with the smell of burning opium. It's a scent that clings to the curtains, the wooden furniture, the very fabric of the room. It is dim, the only light coming from the small oil lamps that are used to heat the drug. There is very little conversation. The overwhelming sound is the soft bubbling of the opium pipes and the quiet rhythmic breathing of the patrons. Men lie on raised platforms or wooden benches. A pipe boy prepares the dose, taking a small trickle-like speck of prepared opium, called chandu, on the end of a long needle. He holds it over the flame of the lamp until it sizzles and swells into a small brown bubble. He then deftly places this bubble onto the tiny opening of the clay pipe bowl. The smoker takes the long stem of the pipe, often made of bamboo, and inhales deeply, slowly. The vapor is not harsh like tobacco smoke. It is smooth, warm, and insidious. And with that inhalation, the world outside falls away. The alkaloids, the morphine and codeine, cross the blood-brain barrier, and the story of the poppy returns to its ancient origins, the release from pain. But this is not the pain of a wound or a sickness. It is the pain of poverty, of hopelessness, of a society in turmoil. It is the pain of being. For a few hours, in the warm, dreamy haze, all of that is gone. There is only a feeling of profound, floating contentment, a waking dream from which one does not wish to be disturbed. At first, it was the wealthy, the scholars and the officials who partook. But as the British flooded the market, the price of opium fell. It became cheaper, more accessible. The habit spread downwards through the social classes. It reached the merchants, the soldiers, the artisans, and finally, the common labourers. The man who pulled a rickshaw, the woman who worked in the silk looms, the farmer struggling with debt. They too could now afford a few precious hours of escape in the dream world of the pipe. The social consequences were devastating. Productivity plummeted. Family savings were drained to pay for the habit. Sons sold their family homes, husbands sold their wives and children, all for a few more scrapes of the dark gum. The fabric of Confucian society, built on filial piety, hard work, and social responsibility, began to unravel. Observers wrote of once thriving towns becoming hollowed-out shells, of listless, emaciated figures shuffling through the streets, their only ambition being their next pipe. The army became enfeebled, its soldiers too addicted to fight effectively. The civil service became corrupted, its officials either addicted themselves or growing rich on the bribes from smugglers. China, the proud celestial empire that had for so long looked down upon the rest of the world, was being brought to its knees, not by an invading army, but by the chemistry of a flower, expertly and ruthlessly deployed as an economic weapon. The river of silver had not only stopped flowing out of Britain, it had reversed its course with a vengeance. So much silver was now flowing out of China to pay for the opium, that it caused a severe economic crisis within the country, devaluing its own currency and impoverishing its people further. The British had solved their trade imbalance with a terrifying efficiency. They had balanced their books on the back of a nation they were systematically poisoning. Back in London, and in the halls of Parliament, there were voices of dissent, men who stood up and called the trade what it was, immoral, unchristian, and a stain upon the nation's honour. But their voices were drowned out by the sheer, undeniable scale of the profit. The opium trade was no longer a fringe enterprise, it was a pillar of the British imperial economy. The revenue it generated paid for the administration of British India. It financed the tea purchases. It enriched the shareholders of the East India Company and the merchants of London. The empire itself was now addicted to the profits of the opium trade, just as surely as the Chinese laborer was addicted to the pipe. This could not last. A confrontation was inevitable. In China, a new emperor, the Daoguang Emperor, came to the throne. He saw the devastation in his country and was determined to act. He appointed an official of extraordinary integrity and resolve, a man named Lin Zexu. Lin was, in a sense, China's first drug czar. He was sent to Canton in 1839 with a simple imperial mandate: eradicate the opium trade completely and permanently. Lin was not like the other corruptible local officials. He was incorruptible and utterly determined. He bypassed the smugglers and went straight to the source, the Western merchants. He blockaded them in their warehouses, the factories at Canton. He demanded that they surrender every last chest of opium in their possession. The British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, at first refused, but Lin was relentless. He cut off their food and water supplies. After a 6-week standoff, Elliot capitulated. He ordered the merchants to surrender their entire stock. It was a staggering amount, over 20,000 chests of opium, representing more than £3 million of the drug worth a fortune. Lin had it all brought to the beach at Human. He ordered 3 massive trenches to be dug and had them filled with the opium, mixed with lime and salt, and then flooded with seawater. For 23 days, the toxic slurry was stirred and then washed out into the South China Sea. It was a powerful symbolic act, a declaration that China would no longer tolerate being the world's narcotics market. When news of this destruction of property, and that is how it was framed in London, as a destruction of private British property reached Britain, the merchants and their allies in Parliament were outraged. They did not speak of the morality of the drug trade. They spoke of free trade, of national honour, of the insult to the British flag. They agitated for war. The debate in Parliament was heated, but in the end, the war hawks, backed by the immense financial power of the opium lobby, won the day. A decision was made to send a naval expedition to China. It was a war fought for the right to traffic drugs. The most powerful nation on earth was going to war with the most populous to force it to accept the importation of a narcotic. The British ships that arrived off the coast of China were marvels of the industrial age. Steam-powered gunboats like the HMS Nemesis could sail against the wind and tide, easily outmaneuvering the traditional Chinese war junks. They were armed with advanced artillery that could bombard coastal forts into rubble from a safe distance. The conflict that followed, known as the First Opium War, was a brutal one-sided affair. The Chinese, with their medieval weaponry and opium-addled soldiers, stood no chance against the military might of the British Empire. Forts were smashed, cities were captured, and the Qing government was forced to sue for peace. The result was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. It was the first of what China would later call the unequal treaties. The terms were humiliating. China was forced to pay a massive indemnity to Britain to cover not only the cost of the war, but also the cost of the very opium that Commissioner Lin had destroyed. They had to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British in perpetuity, and most critically, they were forced to open 5 of their ports to foreign trade. The opium trade, while not explicitly legalized in this treaty, was able to flourish in these new ports, now under the protection of British guns. The dream of the Qing emperors, of a self-sufficient empire free from foreign interference, was shattered. This was the beginning of what is known in China as the Century of Humiliation, a period of being dominated and carved up by Western powers. And it all began with a flower. It began with an economic problem, a trade imbalance over tea, and a simple, brutal solution found in the chemical compounds of the opium poppy. The empire of dreams, built on the profits of addiction, was now firmly established. The joy plant, which for so long had offered a quiet escape from the pains of the body, had been weaponized to break the spirit of a nation. And as the gun smoke clears over the Pearl River Delta, a new era has begun. An era where the ancient relationship between human and plant is now mediated by the cold, hard logic of global capital and imperial power. The quiet rustle of poppy petals in a Bengal field now echoes with the roar of cannon fire across the sea. The story is no longer one of caravans and ancient wisdom. It is now a story of clippers and gunboats and empires. Let that immense, tragic scale just wash over you, the sheer audacity of it all. Don't try to grapple with it. Just let the story hold you. Let the gentle weight of this history settle you deeper into your rest. There is nothing for you to do but drift. Drift on this dark, quiet sea of the past as we follow the poppy on its long, strange and consequential journey. The chapter is closing, and your own well-deserved peace is drawing near. Just breathe and let go. Chapter 4. The Angel and the Fiend, Laudanum and the Victorian Mind. The story has held you, and the weight of it, the gravity of this immense human drama, has been a strange and soothing comfort. We left the poppy on the high seas, a cargo of immense value and immense suffering, ferried across the world in the hulls of ships powered by steam and ambition. But the poppy's journey into the West was not always so loud, so martial. It did not always arrive with the roar of a cannon. Sometimes it slipped in quietly, through the apothecary's door, carried not in a heavy crate, but in a small dark glass bottle. And so our gaze turns from the sun-scorched fields of India and the bustling ports of Canton, and we find ourselves drifting into a different kind of haze, not the smoke of a battlefield, but the fog of London. The gaslights smear the damp cobblestones with a soft, uncertain glow. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and rain. Here, in the heart of the 19th century, in the drawing rooms of Britain and the parlours of America, the poppy is not a foreign commodity to be fought over. It is a domestic companion, a household god, and its most common form, its most intimate vessel, is a tincture of opium and alcohol, a dark, bitter liquid with a deceptively gentle name, laudanum. Let that name settle in your mind. Laudanum. It comes from the Latin word laudare, meaning to praise, a thing to be praised. And for a time it truly was. Before our modern understanding of germs and viruses, before the invention of aspirin or antibiotics, life was a far more painful and precarious affair. Pain was a constant, unwelcome resident in the house of the body. A toothache could become a life-threatening infection. Childbirth was a trial of endurance. Chronic conditions, from neuralgia to rheumatism to the vague but debilitating nervous complaints, had few reliable remedies. The world was simply louder with the sound of human suffering. Into this world, laudanum arrived as a quiet miracle. Imagine for a moment you are a mother in 1860. Your infant has been crying for hours, tormented by the fevers and pains of teething. Nothing will soothe him. The house is filled with a frantic, exhausted anxiety. Then you reach for the small bottle on the shelf. Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, preparations made with opium, designed for the very youngest. You administer a single, careful drop, and within minutes, a profound, almost sacred quiet descends. The crying stops. The feverish tension in that tiny body releases. The child sleeps. To you in that moment, is this liquid not a blessing? Is this poppy, in its distilled and tamed form, not a gift? This was the reality for millions. Laudanum was the great silencer. It quieted the coughs of consumption that echoed through tenements and manors alike. It eased the grinding pain of a factory worker's injury. It took the sharp, cruel edge off a soldier's old wounds. It calmed the racing heart and frayed nerves of the lady of the house, confined by corsets and conventions. It was available everywhere, from the most respected chemist in London to the travelling salesman on the American frontier. No prescription was needed. It was cheaper than gin. It was in the truest sense a panacea, a cure-all. The poppy, in its journey from a distant field to this little bottle, had transformed into a spirit of pure utility, a tireless servant to human comfort. Inside that dark liquid, the poppy's secret chemistry was at work. The alkaloids we have met before, morphine, codeine, were binding to the very same receptors in the brain and spinal cord that are meant for our own natural endorphins. It was a perfect counterfeit key slipping into a biological lock. It didn't just mask the pain, it told the central nervous system that the pain was not important. It sent a message of profound chemical well-being that rippled through the body. It was a switch, turning down the volume of the world's harshness and turning up an inner sense of peace. And because it worked so well, so reliably, it became woven into the very fabric of daily life, an essential part of the household toolkit. But this quiet, dutiful servant had another face. It did not only soothe the body, it could also transport the mind. And it was this quality that drew the attention of another class of user, not the laborer or the housewife, but the artist, the poet, the dreamer. For them, the poppy was not a medicine, it was a muse. Here the story shifts from the quiet nursery and the sickbed to the flickering candlelight of a writer's study. We enter the world of the Romantics, a generation of thinkers and artists who prized emotion over reason, the individual experience over the collective, and the untamed wilderness of nature and the imagination over the orderly garden of civilization. And for many of them, opium was the key to a door they longed to open, the door to the sublime, the terrifying, the deepest and most hidden corridors of the self. Let's sit for a moment with a man named Thomas de Quincey, a brilliant, troubled, and deeply sensitive soul. For him, a painful stomach ailment first led him to a chemist's shop in London in 1804. He purchased a small vial of laudanum, and that night he experienced a revelation. The pain vanished, yes, but something else happened. His mind, he wrote, was introduced to abysses of divine enjoyment. He felt a sense of immense benevolent peace, a feeling that the very anxieties that defined his being had been subsided into an Alp-like stillness. This was the beginning of his lifelong relationship with the drug, a relationship he would document in his famous book Confessions of an English Opium Eater. His writing is our first true travelogue of this inner landscape. He describes what he called the pleasures of opium. Under its influence, the perception of time itself would warp and stretch. A single night of music could feel like a century of unfolding beauty. The most mundane objects and memories would become imbued with a profound, almost mystical significance. His mind became a grand theatre, where his own past experiences were replayed, not as faded memories, but as vivid, living spectacles. The poppy was not creating new worlds, it was simply taking the raw material of his own life and rebuilding it on a scale that was both magnificent and terrifying. He speaks of a mind that could no longer forget. Every trivial detail from his childhood, every face he had ever seen, every word he had ever read, was stored and could be summoned forth in his dreams with perfect clarity. It was like a library where every book was open at once, their stories all shouting to be heard. This is a fascinating echo of what we now understand about how opiates can affect memory consolidation and the dreaming states of REM sleep. The poppy wasn't just dulling pain, it was amplifying the machinery of the subconscious. But De Quincey's book is a story in two parts. After the pleasures came the pains of opium. The grand theatre of the mind became a prison. The dreams once beautiful became vast, oppressive, and inescapable nightmares. He describes dreaming of immense, architecturally impossible cities, of endless staircases he was compelled to climb, of vast tropical landscapes where he felt like a forgotten outcast. He dreamt of being pursued by a terrifying crocodile, a recurring symbol of his inescapable torment. The feeling was one of infinite regress, of being trapped in a maze with no exit. The very faculty that had given him such joy, the inability to forget, now became his curse. His own mind, supercharged by the poppy's alkaloids, had become his persecutor. The gentle muse had revealed itself to be a tyrant. De Quincey's story is not just a personal tragedy, it's a foundational text for our understanding of the dual nature of this substance. He was one of the first to articulate the arc of addiction from the inside, with the precision of a poet. He showed the world that the poppy offered a glimpse of heaven, but the price of admission was often a long, slow descent into a very personal hell. And he was not alone. Let's drift now to the study of another giant of the Romantic movement, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a man of immense genius whose mind was a whirlwind of philosophy, poetry, and theology. Coleridge, too, was a lifelong user of laudanum, initially for a host of physical ailments, and his most famous poem, Kubla Khan, is perhaps the most perfect artifact of the opium dream in all of literature. The story is legendary. Coleridge, having taken a dose of laudanum, fell asleep while reading a travel book. He slept for 3 hours, during which he said he composed an entire perfectly formed poem of 200 to 300 lines. It was not an effort of will, the words and images simply appeared before him, a complete vision. Upon waking, he eagerly began to write it down. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. The lines are hypnotic, otherworldly. They describe a mythical landscape of sacred rivers, sunless seas, and caves of ice. It is a poem that doesn't follow a logical narrative. It flows with the strange associative logic of a dream. But the vision was shattered. As he was writing, he was famously interrupted by a person from Porlock, a visitor on some mundane business. The interruption lasted only an hour, but it was enough. When he returned to his desk, the vision was gone. The rest of the poem, the hundreds of lines that had seemed so clear and vivid just moments before, had vanished like the images on the surface of a stream into which a stone has been cast. All that remained was the fragment we have today. This story is a perfect metaphor for the creative promise and the ultimate unreliability of the poppy as a muse. It can unlock the subconscious, allowing for startling connections and breathtaking imagery. It can dissolve the rigid boundaries of the waking mind. But the gifts it offers are fragile, fleeting, and often incomplete. The person from Porlock has become a symbol for any worldly interruption that breaks a creative spell, but here it represents something deeper, the precariousness of the bridge between the dream world and the waking one. The poppy could show you a paradise, but it could rarely give you a map to bring back. But to see the poppy's influence only through the lens of these male romantic adventurers, De Quincey's psychonaut, Coleridge's dreamer, is to miss a quieter but perhaps more profound part of the story. Let us turn our attention to a woman, the brilliant poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Confined to her room for years by a debilitating spinal injury and a lung ailment, she lived in a state of constant severe pain. For her, laudanum was not a vehicle for exploration. It was a lifeline. It was the tool that allowed her to endure, to think, to write, to love. In her letters, she wrote about her dependence with a clear-eyed frankness. She called it her elixir, the one thing that could keep the silver cord from loosening. Without it, the pain was so overwhelming that the work of writing, the very act of composing her intricate, passionate poetry, would have been impossible. The poppy, for her, was not about opening doors to fantastical realms. It was about making it possible to simply exist in her own room. It was the scaffold that held her mind together while her body was failing. Her story provides a vital counterpoint. It reminds us that for every person seeking visions, there were countless others simply seeking relief. For them, the poppy was not a fiend in disguise. It was a flawed but necessary angel of mercy. It allowed a mind like hers, one of the finest of her generation, to continue to burn brightly against the wind of chronic illness. It is a humbling reminder that the relationship between a person and a substance is never simple. It is always shaped by the landscape of their own life, their own body, their own needs. And so, across the Victorian world, the poppy was playing this dual role. It was the dependable servant in the medicine cabinet, the bringer of quiet and peace, and it was the wild, unpredictable muse in the writer's study, the whisperer of dreams and nightmares. For decades, society seemed content to let these two identities coexist. The user of laudanum for a toothache and the poet plumbing the depths of his subconscious were seen as engaged in fundamentally different acts. One was medicine, the other was a kind of intellectual daring. But a shadow was beginning to fall. The stories of people like De Quincey, which were initially read as thrilling tales of psychological exploration, began to be seen in a different light. Doctors were starting to notice a pattern among their patients who relied on laudanum. They saw the escalating doses, the desperation when a supply ran out, the physical sickness, the nausea, the sweats, the terrible aches that we now call withdrawal. They began to understand that the poppy did not just offer a temporary loan of well-being, it demanded repayment with interest. The very chemistry that made it so effective was also the architecture of its trap. The brain, flooded with these powerful external opiates, begins to adapt. It reduces its own production of natural endorphins. The very receptors that the morphine and codeine bind to become less sensitive. The user's baseline state of being is slowly, insidiously rewritten. To feel normal, they now need the poppy. To feel the initial euphoria, they need more and more. The key, used too often, begins to change the shape of the lock itself. This growing medical understanding began to shift the public perception. The language started to change. What was once a habit was now being described as a vice. What was a personal weakness was becoming a social malady. The user was no longer just a patient or a dreamer. They were becoming an addict, a new and frightening category of person. The angel of mercy was starting to look more and more like a fiend of dependence. And this is where the story takes a dark and crucial turn. As anxiety about opium's grip grew within Western society, a strange and telling division occurred. The respectable user, the middle-class woman taking her laudanum for nerves, the gentleman using it for his gout, was still largely seen as a victim, an object of pity. Their addiction was a private medical tragedy, but society needed a villain. It needed a scapegoat for this rising tide of fear, and it found one in the figure of the immigrant and in the imagined space of the opium den. While hundreds of thousands of Britons and Americans were quietly, legally, and respectably consuming vast quantities of opium in liquid form, a powerful and lurid fantasy was taking hold of the public imagination. It was the image of the dark, smoky lair, hidden in the back alleys of London's Limehouse or San Francisco's Chinatown, a place where supposedly dissolute men and women, often of different races, would lie on hard wooden bunks and lose themselves to the smoke of the opium pipe. This was a profound act of psychological projection. The West had a massive homegrown opiate problem, manifesting in countless bottles of laudanum on countless kitchen shelves. But it was far easier, far more comforting, to imagine the problem as a foreign contagion, something sinister and alien that was creeping into the cities and corrupting the morals of the nation. The method of consumption became a critical dividing line. Drinking laudanum was medicinal, a private affair. Smoking opium, a practice associated with Chinese immigrants, was framed as decadent, hedonistic, and dangerously communal. This fantasy was fueled by sensationalist journalism and popular fiction. Writers like Charles Dickens, in his unfinished final novel The Mystery of Edwin Drood, painted vivid, haunting pictures of these dens, describing them as gateways to degradation and despair. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray shows its protagonist seeking oblivion in the foul dens of the London docks. These were powerful, compelling narratives, and they cemented in the public mind a link between opium, criminality, moral decay, and foreignness. Feel the injustice of this. The poppy plant itself, Papaver somniferum, makes no distinction. The alkaloids in its sap are the same whether they are dissolved in alcohol in London or heated in a pipe in Shanghai. The human brain that receives them is the same. But culture, with its anxieties and its prejudices, drew a sharp, artificial line. The poppy became a screen onto which society projected its deepest fears about race, immigration, and the loss of social control. The fiend was given a face, and it was not the face of the local chemist who sold laudanum by the gallon. It was the face of the Chinese immigrant. This is the cultural atmosphere that L. Frank Baum, the creator of Oz, would have breathed. He was born in 1856, at the very height of laudanum's reign and the beginning of this moral panic. He would have grown up reading the novels, seeing the newspaper illustrations, and absorbing this deeply paradoxical view of the poppy. On the one hand, it was a common, almost banal household remedy. On the other, it was the stuff of Gothic horror, a symbol of exotic danger and moral ruin. And so, when he dipped his pen to write about a field of deadly flowers, he was not just inventing a fantasy. He was tapping into a potent, pre-existing cultural anxiety. The poppy field in Oz is a place of unnatural sleep, of lost will, of mortal danger disguised as beauty. It is a perfect distillation of the Victorian fear of opium's power. It is a place where the familiar, beautiful flower from the garden suddenly reveals its hidden, fiendish nature. It is the laudanum bottle and the opium den rolled into one, transformed into a landscape, the angel and the fiend, growing side by side from the same magical soil. Think of that immense, complicated history, the quiet desperation of the sick room, the soaring ambitions of the poet, the slow grinding machinery of addiction, the ugly convenience of xenophobia, all of it swirling around this one, unassuming plant. The poppy, in the 19th century Western mind, was never just one thing. It was a mirror, reflecting back the hopes, the fears, the genius, and the prejudices of the age. It offered a sleep that could be a cure, a dream that could be a masterpiece, or a stupor that could be a living death. Let this complexity settle around you now. There are no easy answers here, no simple villains or heroes. There is only the intricate, tangled story of a plant and a people, a story of relief and ruin, of creativity and despair. You don't need to unravel it. You don't need to judge it. Your only task is to let the story be your guide into a deeper state of rest. Let the gaslit streets of Victorian London fade into the soft darkness of your own room. The age of laudanum, with all its contradictions, has passed. The chapter is drawing to a close, and all that is asked of you now is to breathe, to let the weight of this history become a comforting blanket, pulling you down into the quiet, untroubled sleep that you deserve. Just drift and let go. Chapter 5: The American Sickness, from Civil War soldiers to street corner crime. And as the last echoes of London's cobblestones fade, we cross an ocean. We drift on the quiet, dark waters of the Atlantic, not forward in time, but sideways, to a different story unfolding under the same patient stars. The Poppies' influence is not limited to one empire. Its seeds are carried on the winds of trade, of war, of human hope, and human suffering. We leave the world of poets and parlors, and we arrive on the shores of a young nation tearing itself apart, America. The year is 1861, and the quiet pastoral poppy is about to meet the violent birth of modern warfare. Before this, the poppy's milk was a folk remedy, a farm wife's friend, a comfort for the teething child or the weary elder, administered in tinctures and tonics. But two inventions, two pieces of human ingenuity, arrived just in time to change everything. First, the final isolation of the poppy's most potent secret, morphine, a pure, predictable, powerful crystal of relief. And second, a tool of terrible intimacy, the hypodermic syringe, a slender needle of silver and glass, capable of delivering that crystalline relief directly into the bloodstream, bypassing all the body's natural gatekeepers. It was a key unlocking a door that nature had intended to keep shut. Now imagine the scene, a field in Gettysburg or Antietam. The air is thick with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid pall of gunpowder. The quiet hands of the poppy seem a world away. Here the wounds are not clean. They are brutal, catastrophic. A new kind of bullet, the mini ball. A soft, heavy piece of lead does not pierce a soldier, it shatters him. It tumbles through the body, pulverizing bone, shredding muscle and organ into a geography of ruin. In the makeshift hospitals, tents filled with the low moan of agony, surgeons work with a desperate, bloody haste. Their saws are often the only tool that can save a life, and they work without the mercy of modern anesthesia. Into this theater of suffering steps the doctor with his small leather case, and inside, two miracles: a vial of clear liquid, a solution of morphine sulfate, and the gleaming silver syringe. For the soldier whose leg has been torn apart, whose insides are on fire, the prick of that needle is nothing. It is the preamble to salvation. And then, the rush. A wave of warmth that begins in the core of the being and spreads to every fingertip, every toe. It is a profound, silencing quiet. The screaming nerve endings are gently hushed. The frantic, terrified heart slows its frantic rhythm. The horror of the tent, the smell of death, the faces of the dying, it all recedes as if wrapped in a thick, warm blanket. The pain does not simply lessen, it becomes irrelevant. It is still there, but it is happening to someone else, in another room, a long way away. In a world of absolute agony, morphine was not a drug, it was a gift from God, and the syringe was the hand that delivered it. Doctors, overwhelmed and under-equipped, used it liberally. It was the most compassionate tool they had. They administered it for the pain of the wound, for the agony of the surgery, and for the dysentery and fevers that tore through the camps like wildfire. And when the cannons finally fell silent, when the ink dried on the surrender at Appomattox, hundreds of thousands of men began the long walk home. They were heroes, survivors, but they carried new wounds, not of lead, but of chemistry. They were gaunt, haunted men, with missing limbs and persistent coughs, but also a deeper affliction, a gnawing, soul-deep craving for the peace they had found in that needle. They called it the army disease, a soldier's sickness. At first it was seen as a mark of sacrifice, a sad but understandable consequence of their valor. These men had given their bodies for their country. It seemed only right that they should have their medicine. They could get it easily. Morphine was available from doctors, from pharmacists, even through mail-order catalogues, sold as a tonic for nervous conditions. These veterans, once the picture of strength, became shadows in their own homes, dependent on the substance that had once saved them. The poppy, which had offered a moment's peace on the battlefield, now demanded a lifetime of servitude in the quiet towns of a healing America. It was the country's first great addiction epidemic, born in the crucible of its most defining conflict. A quiet, personal tragedy replaying itself in tens of thousands of lives, a secret kept behind closed doors, a debt being paid for a war that was supposedly over. And as these soldiers wrestled with their private demons, the nation was changing around them. The war had forged a new industrial America, a country of steel and steam, of factories and railroads. And to build this new country, America looked west, not just across the plains, but across the vast expanse of the Pacific. It looked to China. Men came by the thousands, leaving behind famine and unrest, to do the back-breaking work of blasting tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, of laying the steel tracks that would bind the continent together. They were paid little, they were treated poorly, and they brought with them the traditions of their homeland. Among them, a tradition of solace, a way to endure the unendurable, the ritual of smoking opium. Let us drift now, from the quiet farmlands of the post-war East to the booming, chaotic cities of the West. San Francisco. The air is alive with the salt of the sea, the smell of coal smoke, and the energy of a city built on gold and dreams. Here, in the crowded, bustling alleys of Chinatown, a new scene unfolds. The opium den. We must be careful here. We must resist the cartoonish image that history has given us. We imagine a place of pure vice, of moral decay. But for the men who frequented them, it was something more complex. It was a piece of home. Imagine stepping from the loud, jarring street into a quiet, dimly lit room. The air is heavy, not with smoke but with a sweet, toasted, almost floral scent. It's the smell of raw opium being carefully heated over a small oil lamp. Men are reclining on simple wooden platforms or cushioned mats. There is no loud revelry here, only quiet conversation in their native tongue, the soft click of mahjong tiles, the gentle bubbling of a water pipe. For a Chinese laborer, alienated, overworked, living thousands of miles from his family, this was a sanctuary. It was a social club, a place of community, where the crushing loneliness of his life could be, for a few hours, forgotten. The opium pipe was a key to a different kind of release than the soldier's needle. It was slower, more communal, a gentle unfurling of the mind, a soft blurring of the hard edges of a brutal existence. But America, watching from the outside, did not see a sanctuary. It saw something foreign, something frightening. As the 19th century wore on, economic downturns led to fear and resentment. The same newspapers that had once praised the Chinese for their hard work now painted them as a threat, and the opium den became the perfect symbol for this fear. It was depicted as a place where white men and, most scandalously, white women were lured to their ruin. It was a racial panic, cloaked in the language of moral outrage. The poppy, in this new context, was no longer a medicine or a soldier's curse. It was an alien poison, corrupting the nation's blood. And so the law first took notice of the poppy, not as a medical problem, but as a social one. In 1875, San Francisco passed the first anti-drug law in the country, an ordinance specifically banning the operation of opium dens. It wasn't about public health, it was about targeting a specific community. It was the first time an American law had been used to prohibit a substance associated with a particular race. A pattern was being set. The focus was shifting from the chemical to the user, and the identity of that user was becoming critically important. The soldier with his morphine was a tragic victim. The Chinese laborer with his pipe was a degenerate threat. The poppy's gift had been politicized. The line between medicine and menace, between patient and criminal, was being drawn not by science but by fear. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the world of medicine was undergoing a revolution. Science was the new religion, and the laboratory was its temple. We believed, with an almost religious fervor, that we could deconstruct, understand, and improve upon nature. And in a laboratory in Germany, in 1874, a chemist working for the Bayer pharmaceutical company took the poppy's primary molecule, morphine, and decided to improve it. He performed a simple chemical trick, a process called acetylation. He added 2 small acetyl groups to the morphine molecule. It was a minor alteration, a tiny piece of molecular tailoring. He created something new, diacetylmorphine. For over 2 decades, the discovery sat on a shelf, largely forgotten. But then, in the 1890s, Bayer rediscovered it. They were looking for a new painkiller, one that could replace morphine and its terribly addictive nature. They were also looking for a cough suppressant. Tuberculosis was rampant, a terrifying plague, and the racking coughs of its victims were a source of great suffering. When they tested the new compound, The results were astonishing. It was 5 to 8 times more powerful than morphine as a painkiller, and as a cough suppressant, it was miraculous. It silenced the most violent coughs with an almost supernatural efficiency. The researchers at Bayer felt they had found a wonder drug, a heroic medicine, and so they gave it a brand name derived from the German word for heroic, heroin. Picture the advertisements from the turn of the century. Bayer marketed heroin with the same pride and confidence as they marketed their other new product, aspirin. It was sold over the counter, in pill form, and most commonly as a syrup. Bayer's heroin hydrochloride. For your coughs, your colds, your bronchitis, your asthma, bottles were given out freely by the company's representatives. They even marketed it specifically for children's coughs. And most importantly, they made a claim that seems tragically naive to us now. They claimed it was non-addictive. They believed that the small chemical change they had made had solved the problem of morphine. They thought they had tamed the poppy. They thought they had finally perfected nature's design. For a time it seemed they were right. It was a commercial triumph. Heroin was hailed as a miracle. But soon doctors began to notice something deeply unsettling. Their patients, the ones they had prescribed heroin to for a simple cough, kept coming back. They needed more and more of it. When they tried to stop, they experienced a withdrawal syndrome that made morphine withdrawal seem mild. The sickness was deeper, the craving more ferocious. The scientists at Bayer, in their quest to improve upon the poppy, had not removed its sting. They had concentrated it. That small chemical change, the addition of the acetyl groups, acted like a molecular passport. It allowed the molecule to cross the blood-brain barrier far more quickly and efficiently than morphine. It was a battering ram to the brain's reward centers, delivering a euphoric rush that was faster, more intense, and ultimately, far more addictive than the molecule it was designed to replace. To call it an unintended consequence is a profound understatement. It was a catastrophe born of hubris, the belief that human chemistry could outsmart a plant that had spent millions of years perfecting its own. The American sickness, which began with soldiers and their morphine, now had a new, more powerful and widely available agent. Heroin addiction began to climb, not just among the marginalized, but in the mainstream. It was in middle-class homes, in medicine cabinets, a silent epidemic growing under the banner of scientific progress. The public, which had been panicked by the foreign ritual of the opium den, was now facing a homegrown crisis delivered to them by their own trusted doctors and pharmaceutical companies. The call for control, for something to be done, grew into a roar. The first 2 decades of the 20th century saw a fundamental shift in how America viewed the poppy and its children. The era of casual, unregulated access was coming to a violent end. The tide of public opinion, fueled by stories of addiction and ruin, turned against the patent medicines and unregulated narcotics that had filled American shelves for generations. The first major blow was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. It didn't ban these substances, but it did something revolutionary for its time. It demanded honesty. For the first time, the makers of cough syrups, of soothing tonics, of wellness elixirs had to list their ingredients on the label, and suddenly, the public could see in plain black and white that the remedy for their baby's colic contained opium, that their nerve tonic was laced with cocaine, that their cough syrup was heroin. The veil was lifted. But the true turning point, the piece of legislation that would define America's relationship with drugs for the next century and beyond, was yet to come. It arrived in 1914. It was called the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. On the surface, it was a tax law. It required anyone who produced, imported, or distributed opiates and cocaine to register with the federal government, pay a small tax, and use special order forms. It seemed like a simple piece of regulation, a way of tracking these powerful substances, but its interpretation and its enforcement would change everything. Doctors who prescribed opiates to maintain an addict's habit were suddenly viewed not as caregivers, but as criminals. Pharmacists who filled those prescriptions were arrested. The Supreme Court upheld these aggressive interpretations, and in a few short years, the entire landscape was redrawn. Addiction was no longer a medical condition to be managed by a doctor. It was officially a crime to be handled by the police. The addict was no longer a patient, they were a felon. Think of it like a mighty river. For decades, the river of opiate supply had flowed through legal, open channels, doctors, pharmacies, general stores. The Harrison Act did not stop the river. It simply built a massive dam. And the immense pressure of human demand, of addiction, did not disappear. It simply sought a new path, it was forced underground. The law intended to solve a public health crisis inadvertently created one of the most powerful and violent forces in modern society, the black market. The street corner became the new pharmacy. The kindly doctor was replaced by the illicit dealer. The quality and purity of the drug, once guaranteed by companies like Bayer, were now completely unknown. The price skyrocketed, and for the addict, the person who was once just a patient with a sickness, life became a desperate daily hustle. To get the money to buy the now illegal substance they physically needed, many had to turn to crime, theft, prostitution, dealing. The law had created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By defining addicts as criminals, it created the very conditions that forced them into criminality to survive. The poppy, that beautiful ancient flower, was now at the center of a new kind of war. Not a war between nations, but a war waged by a government against its own people. From the battlefields of the Civil War, to the lanterns of the opium den, to the sterile labs of Germany, and finally to the back alleys of American cities, the poppy's journey had been a long and strange one. It had worn the mask of a savior, a demon, a miracle cure, and now a public enemy. As we let this chapter of the story settle, feel the immense weight of that transformation, the shift from a medical problem to a moral failing, from a patient to a criminal. It is a heavy history, full of good intentions and devastating results, but you do not need to carry its weight. You are just a quiet observer, watching the currents of history from a safe and comfortable distance. Let the story be a murmur, a gentle rhythm in the background. The details can blur and soften. The names and dates can drift away like smoke. All that matters is the steady, calming sound of the narrative, a guide leading you away from the complexities of the waking world and deeper into the simple, peaceful world of your own rest. Just listen and let go. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. The Modern Poppy. Geopolitics, Proxy Wars, and the Golden Triangle. And as you let go, the murmur of the story continues, but the stage begins to change. The soft, gaslit glow of the 19th century flickers and fades, giving way to a new kind of light, a harsher, brighter, more chaotic glare. The quiet shuffle of slippers on wooden floors is replaced by the distant rhythmic hum of engines, the crackle of radio static, the tremor of a world remaking itself in the crucible of two global wars. The old empires, the ones that first carried the poppy's sleepy commerce across the oceans, are now ghosts. Their grand colonial houses are empty, their flags lowered, their maps being furiously redrawn by new hands with new ambitions. In this new world, the poppy does not vanish. It does not retreat. A plant, after all, has no politics. It has no allegiance. It has only its own ancient chemistry, its own patient biology. It simply waits for the right soil, the right climate, and the right cultivator. And in the vacuum left by the collapse of the old order, new gardeners would come. They would not be botanists or merchants in frock coats. They would be soldiers, spies, revolutionaries, and refugees. They would find in the poppy's milky sap not just a balm for pain or a key to dreams, but something far more potent, the fuel for armies, the currency of clandestine wars, and the foundation for shadow empires built in places the rest of the world had tried to forget. Our journey takes us now into the heart of this new landscape, to a place that would be given a name whispered with a mixture of fear and mystique, the Golden Triangle. Imagine a place on the map where the borders of three nations, Burma, which we now call Myanmar, along with Thailand and Laos, dissolve into one another in a labyrinth of mountains. These are not the epic, jagged peaks of the Himalayas, but a seemingly endless swell of green, forest-clad hills, rising and falling like the breath of a sleeping giant. For centuries, this region has been a world apart, inhabited by dozens of distinct ethnic groups, the hill tribes, who lived according to their own ancient rhythms, far from the concerns of the capital cities in the flatlands below. The Lahu, the Wa, the Karen, the Shan, the Arka, the Hmong. To them, the lines on the maps were meaningless. Their home was the forest, the village, the mountain, and in their small slash-and-burn clearings, nestled high in the cool mountain air, they grew the poppy. For them it was a tradition, a medicine, and a source of cash for the few necessities they could not make themselves. Salt, metal tools, bullets for their hunting rifles. It was a part of their world, but it did not define it. The cultivation was small-scale, the opium consumed locally or traded in modest quantities. It was a quiet, domestic affair. But after the Second World War, and more importantly, After the communist victory in China in 1949, the world came crashing into these quiet mountains. A defeated army, the Kuomintang, or KMT, fled from Mao's forces, a river of tens of thousands of soldiers and their families pouring over the border from China's Yunnan province into the remote Shan state of Burma. They were an army without a country, a government in exile with no territory to govern. They were stranded, but they were not yet beaten. Their leaders, loyal to Chiang Kai-shek, still dreamed of one day retaking the mainland. But an army, even a refugee army, needs two things to survive: food and guns, and both require money. Cut off from their former supply lines, surrounded by a Burmese government that wanted them gone, and viewed with suspicion by the Thais, the KMT had to become self-sufficient. They were a military organization, skilled in logistics, command and control, and they found themselves in a land where the one truly valuable cash crop grew like a weed. It was a marriage of convenience, a dark and powerful symbiosis. The KMT generals realized that the poppy was their salvation. They had the guns and the organization to protect the trade. The hill tribes had the generational knowledge to cultivate the flower. The KMT offered the tribes protection from the Burmese army, from rival factions, from bandits in exchange for their opium harvest. They didn't just buy the opium, they organized it. They imposed a tax, a system. They established themselves as the new masters of this remote land. And so the quiet poppy fields of the hill tribes began to change. They grew larger, climbing higher up the hillsides. The traditional cycle of subsistence farming was slowly replaced by the relentless logic of monoculture. The poppy, with its incredible value-to-weight ratio, was simply more profitable than rice or vegetables. A farmer could earn 10 times more growing opium than any other crop. For people living on the edge of survival, this was not a moral choice, it was an economic one. The KMT took the raw, sticky opium and, using their military discipline, created a supply chain. They organized mule caravans, long lines of hundreds of animals, each laden with precious cargo, trekking for weeks through a nearly impassable maze of jungle paths, down from the highlands of Burma to the borders of Thailand and Laos. These mule trains were armed affairs, guarded by veteran soldiers. They became legends of the region, ghost armies moving through the wilderness. This was the birth of the Golden Triangle as an industrial-scale producer of narcotics. The KMT were not just farmers or traders, they were the board of directors for a massive vertically integrated enterprise. They controlled the cultivation, the collection, the transportation, and the initial sale. The quiet stream of local opium became a flood, and that flood was about to connect with a powerful new current, the Cold War. As we settle deeper into this story, feel the humid air of the jungle, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Picture the steep green hillsides, scarred with the improbable vibrant color of the poppy fields in bloom, a sea of white, pink and red under a hazy sun. This beauty is deceptive. It is the serene face of a much deeper, more complex system, a system that was about to receive a powerful invisible partner. In Washington, D.C., the world was seen through a single stark lens: communism versus the free world. The fall of China was a catastrophic loss. The primary goal of American foreign policy was containment, stopping the spread of communism at all costs, especially in Southeast Asia, where the domino theory predicted that if one nation fell, the rest would follow. This great geopolitical struggle was not always fought with conventional armies on declared fields of battle. It was a war of shadows, of proxy forces, of quiet funding and clandestine operations. The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was the instrument of this shadow war. Its job was to find, fund, and support anti-communist allies, wherever they might be. And in the remote mountains of Burma, there was a large, well-organized anti-communist army, the KMT. They were a ready-made proxy force, perfectly positioned to harass and gather intelligence on communist China. There was just one problem: their funding came from opium. Here, history becomes murky, a landscape of whispers, declassified documents, and plausible deniability. The official position was, and is, one of non-involvement, but the evidence suggests a more complicated truth, a pragmatic and deeply compromised alliance. To the CIA, the KMT's fight against communism was the priority. Their methods of funding that fight were a secondary and perhaps inconvenient concern. The agency needed a way to supply its allies in the region without overt official involvement. This led to the creation of proprietary airlines, like Air America. On paper, they were private commercial ventures. In reality, they were the logistical wing of the CIA. Their planes and pilots, often daring, ex-military adventurers, flew unmarked aircraft into tiny makeshift dirt airstrips deep in the jungle, delivering weapons, ammunition and supplies to the KMT and other anti-communist groups like the Hmong in Laos. And what did those planes carry on the return journey? The allegation that has persisted for decades is that they often flew out laden with opium. It was the perfect black market transaction. The CIA didn't need to fund its allies with suitcases of cash from Congress. The allies could fund themselves. The agency simply provided the logistical support that made their business more efficient. Planes could transport in a matter of hours what would take a mule train weeks. Think of it not as a direct order, but as a deliberate turning of a blind eye. The poppy fields were allowed to flourish, the trade allowed to continue, because it served a greater geopolitical purpose. The war on communism superseded the war on drugs. The poppy became a silent, unacknowledged weapon in the Cold War. With this new efficient transport and a geopolitical green light, the Golden Triangle exploded. The raw opium collected by the KMT was no longer enough. The market demanded a more refined, more potent, and more easily smuggled product. Deep in the jungle, clandestine labs were established. At first they were crude, producing a coarse morphine base, but as chemists, often fleeing from Shanghai and Hong Kong, brought their expertise, the process grew more sophisticated. Imagine a small clearing, hidden under a dense triple canopy of jungle, the air thick with the smell of chemicals. Here the raw, dark opium gum is cooked in 44-gallon drums, mixed with lime, ammonia, and heated over open fires. It's a dangerous, volatile process, a kind of dark alchemy, transforming the plant's natural latex into a concentrated block of morphine base. But the final step was the most transformative. Using acetic anhydride, a common industrial chemical, that morphine base was converted into diacetylmorphine, heroin. Number 4, heroin. A pure white fluffy powder, perfect for the international market. The Golden Triangle was no longer just a producer of opium, it was now the world's foremost manufacturer of high-grade heroin, and the world was about to develop a voracious appetite for it. The Vietnam War was raging just next door. Hundreds of thousands of young American soldiers were stationed in a brutal, confusing and demoralizing conflict. They were looking for an escape, a way to numb the fear and the boredom. And the pure, cheap heroin from the Golden Triangle began to flood into the bars and back alleys of Saigon and other military bases. It was so pure it could be smoked or sniffed, avoiding the stigma of the needle, and it was incredibly cheap. A crisis of addiction took hold within the American military, a quiet casualty of the very same proxy wars the opium trade was helping to fund. From Vietnam, the supply lines stretched further. They followed the pathways of global commerce, run by sophisticated Chinese syndicates or triads based in Bangkok and Hong Kong. They moved the heroin to Europe and most importantly to the United States. A poppy flower blooming on a remote hillside in Burma ended its journey in a glassine bag on a street corner in New York City. The quiet world of the hill tribes had been connected, inextricably, to the social upheavals of the West. The poppy had become globalized. This entire sprawling enterprise, from the farmer to the mule driver, the chemist to the warlord, the pilot to the smuggler, the dealer to the addict, functioned like a dark ecosystem. It was resilient, adaptive, and decentralized. Shutting down one route only meant another would open up. Arresting one warlord only created a power vacuum for another to fill. The poppy had woven itself so deeply into the political and economic fabric of the region that to remove it would be to unravel the entire society. It provided jobs, funded governments in waiting, and paid for the weapons that kept the fragile, violent peace. And then, just as the Golden Triangle seemed to be the permanent, unchallengeable center of the world's opium production, the tectonic plates of geopolitics began to shift once more. The Vietnam War ended. America withdrew from Southeast Asia. The Cold War's focus began to drift, and a new conflict, in a landscape a world away, was about to create a new, even larger garden for the poppy. Let the scene shift. Let the humid green jungle of Southeast Asia dissolve. The air grows thin, dry, and cold. The landscape flattens into arid plains and then rises into some of the most formidable and magnificent mountains on Earth. We are no longer in the Golden Triangle. We have traveled west, along the old Silk Road, to a place that will come to be known as the Golden Crescent. a region encompassing parts of Iran, Pakistan, and at its heart, the rugged, unconquerable land of Afghanistan. For centuries, Afghanistan too had a relationship with the poppy. It grew well in the fertile river valleys, like Helmand province in the south. It was a folk medicine, a local commodity, part of the rhythm of life, but it was nothing like the industrial scale of the Golden Triangle. Afghanistan was a marginal player on the global stage. That all changed on Christmas Eve, 1979. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a struggling communist government. This was a direct, brutal challenge, and the United States, still smarting from Vietnam, was determined to answer it. But they would not send American troops. They would fight another proxy war. They would fund and arm the local Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. The pattern once seen is unmistakable. It's the same dark equation that played out in the Golden Triangle, just with different variables. The Mujahideen needed money. They needed it to buy weapons beyond what their foreign patrons supplied, to feed their fighters, to sustain a decade-long war of attrition against a superpower. And the poppy was there. It was the perfect crop for a war zone. It requires little water compared to wheat. It is easily transportable. It does not spoil, and its value is immense. A farmer in a remote village could grow a crop that would fund a revolution. The CIA, along with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, funneled billions of dollars in weapons and training to the Mujahideen. Once again, the primary mission was to fight communism. The source of the Mujahideen's own independent funding was, at best, a secondary concern. The refugee camps in Pakistan, which housed millions of Afghans fleeing the war, became hubs for the heroin trade. The same mountain passes that carried weapons into Afghanistan carried opium out. Labs, modeled on those in the Golden Triangle, sprung up along the volatile Afghan-Pakistan border. The expertise, developed in one proxy war, was transferred to the next. The Golden Crescent was not just competing with the Golden Triangle, it was surpassing it. The scale of cultivation in Afghanistan began to dwarf anything seen before. The vast, flat, irrigated plains of Helmand were perfect for poppy cultivation on a scale unimaginable in the steep hills of Burma. And when the Soviets finally withdrew, defeated, in 1989, they did not leave behind a peaceful, stable nation. They left a power vacuum, a country shattered by war, awash with weapons, and ruled by competing warlords. And what funded the private armies of these warlords? What paid for their tanks, their artillery, their endless civil war? Opium. The poppy had become the lifeblood of Afghanistan's entire political economy. It was more than just a cash crop. It was the state's central bank, its treasury, and its main export, all rolled into one. When the Taliban rose from this chaos in the mid-1990s, their relationship with the poppy was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. As puritanical Islamists, they publicly condemned the drug, but they understood its power. They did not eradicate the fields, they taxed them. They levied a 10% tax, an usher, on the opium harvest, framing it as a legitimate Islamic tax. In doing so, they became the most well-funded and organized drug cartel the world had ever seen. The poppy funded their conquest of nearly the entire country. In the year 2000, in a bid for international legitimacy and recognition, the Taliban leader, Mullah Omar, issued a stunning decree, a fatwa, banning all poppy cultivation, and because of their absolute terrifying control over the populace, it worked. In one season, they wiped out nearly the entire crop. Afghanistan's opium production plummeted by over 90%. They proved it could be done. But the world did not grant them the recognition they craved. And then came September 11, 2001. The world changed overnight. The United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban and hunt for Al-Qaeda. In the ensuing chaos, with the Taliban's authority shattered, the farmers went back to the one crop they knew would guarantee their survival. The poppy fields returned, and they returned with a vengeance. In the years that followed, under the watch of the world's most powerful militaries, Afghanistan's opium production didn't just recover, it exploded to levels that dwarfed all previous records. It became a truly wicked problem, a knot that could not be untied. Consider the dilemma from the perspective of an Allied soldier on the ground. Your mission is to win the hearts and minds of the local population to fight the insurgency. But the insurgency is funded by opium, so you are also tasked with eradicating the poppy fields. But when you destroy a farmer's crop, you destroy his family's only livelihood. You push him directly into the arms of the Taliban, who will pay him to plant poppy and protect his fields. Every effort to fight the drug trade seemed to strengthen the insurgency, and every effort to fight the insurgency seemed to require ignoring the drug trade. The poppy had become an inextricable part of the conflict itself. It was the perfect fuel for a guerrilla war. It provided endless, untraceable funding for the Taliban and other groups. It corrupted the new Afghan government from the village elder to the highest levels in Kabul. The money from the poppy fields in Helmand bought weapons, paid fighters, and bribed officials, creating a cycle of violence and corruption that seemed impossible to break. The supply chain was now more sophisticated than ever. It was a global network, with routes running through Pakistan, through Iran and Turkey into Europe, the Balkan route, and north through Central Asia into Russia, the northern route. The raw opium of Afghanistan was feeding addiction and instability across the whole hemisphere. A decision made by a poor farmer in a dusty village, a man just trying to feed his children, was having ripple effects in the suburbs of Moscow, the housing estates of London, and the cities of North America. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? The sheer scale of it all. We can trace the journey of this one plant, this Papaver somniferum, as it navigates the turbulent currents of modern history. It is a passive traveler, a silent witness. It holds no ideology. It feels no ambition. It is simply a biological organism with a unique chemical gift. But in the hands of human beings, that chemistry has been transmuted into a force that has shaped nations, fueled wars, financed terror, and created empires of crime. From the quiet mountains of the Golden Triangle, tended by hill tribes and managed by a refugee army, to the vast, sun-baked plains of the Golden Crescent, where it became the currency of jihad and insurgency. The poppy's modern story is a mirror, reflecting the great power struggles of our time. It shows us how the lines blur between covert operations and criminal enterprise, between fighting for freedom and feeding addiction. And all the while, the plant itself just grows. In the spring, the fields are a startling, ephemeral green. Then the buds swell, and for a few glorious weeks, the landscape is transformed by a blizzard of delicate petals, white, pink, red, and purple. It is a sight of profound and deceptive beauty. Then the petals fall, leaving the green swollen pods, the pale globes that hold the milky treasure. The harvest begins. The pods are scored with the same multi-bladed knives used for centuries, and the white latex weeps out, oxidizing in the air, turning dark and sticky. The cycle begins anew. The names and the players change. The KMT, the CIA, the Mujahideen, the Taliban. They are all just gardeners of a different sort, cultivating the poppy for their own ends. But the poppy outlasts them all. It is a far more patient and resilient force. Its story is woven now into the very soil of these conflict zones, a quiet, botanical power that continues to shape our world in ways we can barely comprehend. As you rest now, let the weight of this history settle. You do not need to hold on to the details. The names of the warlords, the routes of the smugglers, the acronyms of the agencies, they can all drift away. Think only of the poppy field itself, a quiet place under a vast sky, a place of immense beauty and immense complexity, a single flower, containing within its seed pod the power to heal and the power to destroy, the source of relief and the source of so much human sorrow. It is a paradox, a botanical mystery that we have spent a century trying and failing to control. And in that paradox, there is a strange, quiet humility, a reminder that we are not always the masters of the natural world. Sometimes it is a simple flower that dictates the course of our own grand and troubled history. Just listen to the quiet, and let the story fade into the stillness of your rest. Chapter 7. The Pill and the Crisis. How medicine revived an old epidemic. That quiet, that stillness. It feels like an ending, a place to rest. But some silences are not peaceful. Some are the deep, indrawn breath before a storm. Some are the heavy quiet of a hospital waiting room in the dead of night. The story of our relationship with the poppy, with Papaver somniferum, did not end with the taming of morphine or the outlawing of heroin. In fact, the quiet of the mid-20th century was simply a pause, a dormant season, because the paradox of the flower, its power to heal and its power to destroy, was about to find a new, modern and devastating expression. We thought we had mastered it. We thought we had put its ghost in a bottle, but we only built it a new and more inviting home, right in the heart of our own medicine cabinets. So, settle in now. Let the world outside fade away. There is no need to fight sleep. Let these words simply wash over you as you drift. We are going to follow a single molecule, a child of the poppy, on its journey from a German laboratory to the epicenter of a national tragedy. This is not a story of shadowy back alleys and clandestine trade routes. This is a story that begins in the brightest of places, in the noble human quest to conquer pain. For centuries, the problem remained the same. The alkaloids of the poppy were miraculous, but they were also a trap. Morphine, the gold standard of pain relief, came with a terrible price. Its relief was a soaring peak, followed by a plunging valley, a powerful rush that the body and mind would soon crave with a desperation that could erase a life. For a doctor, for a patient suffering from the agony of cancer, or surgery, or a chronic grinding illness, this was the devil's bargain. To grant relief from pain, you had to risk unleashing a different kind of suffering. And so the great dream of 20th century pharmacology was born. To cleave the molecule in two, to somehow separate the pain-relieving properties of the opioid from its addictive euphoric properties, to create a non-addictive opioid. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, like dry water or silent thunder, but it was the holy grail of pain medicine. The goal was to engineer a key that could turn the lock of pain relief in the brain without also turning the lock of addiction, a molecule that would whisper to the pain receptors but not shout at the pleasure centers. The journey begins not with the familiar milky sap of the opium poppy, but with a different alkaloid, a cousin to morphine and codeine, called the bane. The bane is found in smaller quantities in Papaver somniferum, but it is the principal alkaloid in another species, the Persian poppy, Papaver bracteatum. On its own, the bane is not a painkiller. In fact, it is a convulsant, a poison. But to a chemist, it is not a poison, it is a starting point. It is a scaffold, a beautiful complex molecular chassis upon which they could build something new. In a laboratory in Germany, in 1916, chemists took this curious molecule, the bane, and began to tinker. They were molecular architects, adding an atom here, tweaking a bond there, trying to sculpt the poppy's raw material into something safer, something more predictable, and they succeeded. They created two new molecules, oxycodone and hydrocodone, semi-synthetic opioids, part poppy, part human ingenuity. For decades, these new molecules were used, but often in combination with other milder painkillers like aspirin or acetaminophen. They were seen as useful, but not revolutionary. They were just another tool in the medical kit. They existed as Percocet, as Vicodin, names that would become household words, but they were not yet the epicenter of the storm. The problem of the peak and the valley, the rush of euphoria, was still there. They were still powerful, addictive drugs used cautiously for short-term acute pain. The Holy Grail remained elusive. The real shift, the quiet tremor that would set off the earthquake, came much later, in the 1990s. It came from a single company, Purdue Pharma, and a single brilliant and catastrophic idea. The problem, they reasoned, was not the molecule itself, but the delivery system. The rush, the euphoria, was a product of the drug flooding the brain all at once. What if, they thought, you could deliver a powerful dose of oxycodone not in a sudden wave, but as a slow, gentle, steady tide? They developed a pill, a technological marvel in its own right, called OxyContin. The pill itself was a fortress. It contained a huge dose of pure oxycodone, far more than was in a standard Percocet tablet, but it was locked away inside a patented time-release mechanism, a matrix of polymers and binders designed to dissolve slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the digestive tract. It was like a microscopic dam, engineered to release the river of relief over a full 12 hours. One pill in the morning, one at night, and a patient's pain could be held at bay in a constant, stable state of relief. On the surface, it was the answer to a century of prayers. No more peaks and valleys, no more clock watching for your next dose. And the company argued, with no sudden rush to the brain, there would be no euphoria. And with no euphoria, the risk of addiction was, they claimed, vanishingly small. Less than 1%, they told the medical world. It was the Holy Grail, delivered in a little plastic bottle, a safe, long-acting opioid for all kinds of chronic pain, from a bad back to arthritis, healing without the harm. The poppy, finally and truly tamed by science. It's hard to overstate the seismic shift this created in the medical world. For generations, doctors had been trained to be profoundly suspicious of opioids. They were a last resort reserved for the dying or those in the most extreme short-term agony. This was a deep-seated medical caution, born from witnessing the destruction of morphine and heroin addiction firsthand. But now, a new gospel was being preached, and it was being preached with the force of a multi-billion-dollar marketing campaign. Purdue Pharma assembled one of the largest and most aggressive sales forces in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. They were a well-dressed, well-spoken army, descending on doctors' offices in every corner of the country, especially in small, rural towns where people did hard, physical labor and lived with chronic pain. They came bearing gifts, free meals, paid speaking gigs, all expenses paid trips to pain management seminars in beautiful resorts. And they came bearing a simple, revolutionary message: pain is a disease, and we have the cure. They promoted a new concept: pain as the fifth vital sign. Just as a doctor measures your temperature, your heart rate, your breathing and your blood pressure, they should, the campaign argued, be measuring and treating your pain with the same level of seriousness. It was a compassionate, humanistic message that was incredibly difficult for a doctor to argue with. Their fundamental oath is to relieve suffering. How could they deny a patient relief when a seemingly miraculous, non-addictive cure was now available? The company funded studies, created patient advocacy groups, and published literature, all reinforcing the same idea. The risk of addiction was an overblown, outdated myth. Doctors who were still hesitant were framed as behind the times, as lacking compassion, of letting their patients suffer needlessly because of opiophobia. It was a brilliantly executed campaign, a complete rewriting of medical orthodoxy in less than a decade. And so, the prescriptions began to flow, a quiet flood, then a torrent, for coal miners in Appalachia with crushed vertebrae, for factory workers with ruined backs, for farmers with joints worn down by a lifetime of labor, for ordinary people with fibromyalgia, with migraines, with sciatica. The little pills, stamped with OC, became a symbol of a new kind of freedom, freedom from pain. Imagine, for a moment, you are one of those patients. You have lived for years with a deep, grinding ache that has been the background noise of your entire life. It has kept you from sleeping, from playing with your children, from working, from living. You've tried everything: physical therapy, anti-inflammatories, ice packs, heat pads. Nothing truly touches it. Then your doctor, a man you have trusted your whole life, tells you there is something new, a miracle pill. Safe, he says. Non-addictive, he says. You take the first one. And within an hour, something happens that you had forgotten was possible. The pain doesn't just recede, it vanishes. It is not masked, it is gone. And in its place is not a dizzying narcotic high, but a profound sense of well-being. A warm, quiet, peaceful feeling washes over you. The tight knot of tension in your shoulders that you have carried for a decade simply dissolves. You can breathe deeply for the first time in years. You can think clearly. You are not just free from pain, you feel better than well. You feel whole again. For weeks, for months, it is a miracle. You are your old self again. You can work, you can laugh, you can live. The pill is your faithful companion. But then, a subtle change begins. A quiet, insidious shift in the calculus of your own body. The 12 hours of relief starts to feel more like 10. You can feel the old ache beginning to whisper at the edges, a few hours before your next dose is due. This is tolerance. Your body's brilliant. Adaptive nature is recognizing this new chemical and is adjusting its own internal chemistry to compensate. It is down-regulating its own natural pain relief systems. It is learning to expect the pill. So your doctor, still believing the pill is safe, ups your dose, and the relief comes back. But the process has begun. Your body is no longer just being visited by this molecule, it is rebuilding its entire house around it. The opioid receptors in your brain, those tiny locks that the drug so perfectly fits, are now demanding their key. Not for well-being, but just to feel normal. Soon, the absence of the pill is not just the return of your original pain. It is something new, and something far, far worse. A deep cellular sickness. A crawling sensation under your skin, a cold sweat in the middle of the night, a churning in your gut, an anxiety so profound it feels like impending doom. This is withdrawal. This is your own nervous system screaming for the chemical it can no longer live without. The medicine has become the disease, the cure has become the curse. And here is the most terrible part of the trap. The company's central claim that the time-release mechanism prevented addiction rested on a fatal flaw. It worked only as long as the pill was swallowed whole. But people discovered very quickly that if you crushed the pill, you could bypass the time-release fortress entirely. Crushing it turned this slow, steady tide of medicine into a massive, instantaneous wave of pure, potent oxycodone. It could be snorted or dissolved and injected, and in doing so, it delivered a euphoric rush that was, by some accounts, twice as powerful as heroin. The non-addictive miracle drug was, in fact, a perfect delivery system for addiction. It contained its own poison pill, a secret that could be unlocked with a simple spoon and a lighter. The knowledge spread like a virus, through whispers in struggling towns, through hushed conversations, through the desperate logic of addiction. A single pill, obtained legally from a trusted doctor, could be turned into a dose of a high-grade narcotic more powerful than anything available on the street. The line between patient and addict, so clear and bright in the marketing brochures, dissolved into a murky, tragic grey. The person who began taking OxyContin for a legitimate back injury found themselves, a year later, crushing pills just to get through the day, not for the pain in their back, but for the sickness in their soul. Their life began to shrink, its horizon contracting until it was no bigger than the next prescription, the next pill. And for the doctors, it was a waking nightmare. They had entered medicine to heal, and now they were watching their patients, their neighbors, their friends, wither away before their eyes. They were caught in an impossible bind. If they continued to prescribe the medication, they risked feeding a patient's addiction. If they cut the patient off, they would send them into the agony of withdrawal, and often straight into the arms of the street-level drug trade. Many doctors, wrestling with their own conscience and the overwhelming pressure from both patients and pharmaceutical reps, simply continued to write the scripts. Others, seeing the devastation, stopped entirely, leaving a generation of newly minted addicts with nowhere to turn. And when the pills became too expensive, or the doctors too wary, there was an even cheaper, more available, and more deadly alternative waiting: heroin. The chemistry is so similar, the effect on the brain is nearly identical. Addiction is a frugal master. It does not care about the origin of the molecule, only its effect. A vast new market for heroin had been created, not in the inner cities, but in the small towns and suburbs of America. The Poppies' oldest, most notorious ghost had been resurrected by its modern scientific child. The crisis unfurled not like a sudden explosion, but like a slow, silent flood. It crept into homes and hollowed them out from the inside. It erased futures. It shattered families. The overdose numbers began to climb, at first slowly, then with terrifying speed. First responders began carrying naloxone, an opioid overdose reversal drug, as a standard part of their kit. They would be called to the same houses, over and over, to revive people who had stopped breathing, their faces blue, their bodies limp. A whole new vocabulary of tragedy entered the mainstream: revival, relapse, loss. The landscape of communities changed. Pharmacies were robbed. The foster care system swelled with children whose parents had been lost to addiction. The obituaries in local newspapers began to tell a coded story of young people dying suddenly or unexpectedly at home. An entire generation, particularly in the industrial Midwest and Appalachia, began to disappear. And underneath all this human tragedy lies a quiet, profound biological truth. Opioids are so effective at creating dependence because they do not just visit our nervous system, they colonize it. Our brains are hardwired with a beautiful, intricate system for managing pain, pleasure, and reward. It is run by our own, naturally produced opioids called endorphins. They are the source of the runner's high, the feeling of relief after an injury, the sense of well-being that comes from a good meal or the company of loved ones. It is a subtle, balanced, and self-regulating system. When you introduce an external opioid like oxycodone, you are not just supplementing this system, you are overwhelming it with a chemical sledgehammer. The brain, in its infinite wisdom and adaptability, senses this constant artificial flood of pleasure and relief, and it does what any smart system would do. It shuts down its own production. Why make your own endorphins when you are getting a massive, reliable supply from the outside? It recalibrates what it considers normal. The brain's reward pathways, the ancient circuits that tell us what is important for survival, food, water, safety, connection, are hijacked. The opioid molecule becomes to the brain more important than any of these things. It rewrites the very code of desire. This is not a moral failing. It is not a weakness of character. It is a hijacking of the most fundamental machinery of our own biology. It is a brain disease induced by a chemical key that was designed with astonishing precision to fit the locks of our own neurons. The quest to separate healing from harm, to engineer a safe version of the poppy's power, had led to a catastrophe. In our ambition to outwit the plant's chemistry, we had only amplified its most dangerous properties and delivered them to the public with the trusted seal of modern medicine. We thought we were the masters of the molecule, but the molecule, a simple arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, was the master of us. It exposed a dark underbelly of the modern pharmaceutical industry, where the drive for profit could eclipse the fundamental duty to do no harm. It revealed the terrifying vulnerability of our own biology, the ease with which our own survival instincts can be turned against us. And it brought us back, full circle, to the original paradox of that beautiful, unassuming flower, Papaver somniferum, a plant that holds within its cells both the most profound relief from suffering and the most profound capacity to create it. For all our science, for all our hubris, we had not solved its riddle. We had only written a new, and perhaps the most tragic chapter in its long and tangled history with humankind. And now, just let that story rest. Let the complexities fade. Let the quiet in the room be a gentle one, a peaceful one. There is nothing more to analyze, nothing more to understand tonight. There is only the rhythm of your own breathing, the slow, steady beat of your own heart, a reminder of the simple, resilient biology of your own body, finding its way toward rest, toward renewal. Just listen to the quiet, and let the world drift away. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. Waking from the poppy's dream, legacy and the future. Chapter in its long and tangled history with humankind. And now, just let that story rest. Let the complexities fade. Let the quiet in the room be a gentle one, a peaceful one. There is nothing more to analyze, nothing more to understand tonight. There is only the rhythm of your own breathing, the slow, steady beat of your own heart, a reminder of the simple, resilient biology of your own body, finding its way toward rest, toward renewal. Just listen to the quiet, and let the world drift away. But, just before we go, let's open our eyes one last time, not to the bright light of day, but in the soft, comfortable dimness of this room. Let's drift back for just a moment, back to where our journey began, to that impossible field of crimson under a painted sky. Dorothy, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Lion, all running through a sea of poppies. When we first pictured it, perhaps it felt like a fantasy, a beautiful dreamlike danger, as whimsical as a talking lion or a man made of tin. But now that we have traveled through centuries of history, through the quiet halls of medicine and the shadowed alleys of trade, now that we have peered into the very molecules of this plant, that field looks different, doesn't it? It's no longer just a fantasy, it has weight. Each delicate paper-thin petal carries the gravity of history. In that sea of red, we can now see the relief of a soldier on a Napoleonic battlefield, his pain finally silenced by laudanum. We can see the quiet desperation in the eyes of a Victorian mother, spooning a dose of soothing syrup into her crying child, unaware of the ghost she is inviting into her home. We see the dreams of the romantic poets, their minds unlocked for a time by the strange magic of opium. And we see the profound, crushing weight of addiction, the chains forged not of iron, but of a chemical bond between a plant alkaloid and a human receptor. That field is a symbol, now transformed. It is the perfect, beautiful, terrifying embodiment of humanity's long and troubled relationship with Papaver somniferum, a relationship of desire and destruction, of healing and of profound harm. It is a dream from which we are constantly trying to awaken, yet one to which we are constantly tragically drawn back. The story of that dream in the 20th century, and our attempts to wake from it, became a story of war. Not a war between nations, but a war on a substance, a war on a plant. It was an unprecedented human endeavor, a global campaign to sever our connection with the poppy's darker side. It was called, quite simply, the war on drugs. It's a phrase that sounds so clear, so decisive, but the reality, like everything else with this plant, is far more complex. To declare war on a plant is a strange kind of hubris. It's like declaring war on the tide or on the wind. The poppy, after all, has no ideology. It has no army. It has only a biological imperative: to grow, to create its seeds, and to protect them with a brilliant chemical arsenal that just so happens to intersect perfectly with the deepest parts of our own neurochemistry. The war was fought not with poppies, but with people. It was a vast, sprawling campaign of eradication, of legislation, of incarceration. It was a story of helicopters flying low over the mountains of Afghanistan and the fields of Colombia, spraying herbicides, trying to erase the plant from the landscape. But nature is a patient gardener. For every field destroyed, the desperation of poverty and the relentless demand of a global market would simply plant another, somewhere more remote, somewhere more hidden. The effort was like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. This war created its own strange ecology. In trying to stamp out the supply, it inadvertently created a Darwinian pressure for the suppliers to become more efficient, more ruthless, more powerful. Small-time growers were replaced by vast, sophisticated cartels. The logistics of this hidden global trade became a dark mirror to our own legitimate commerce. It developed its own shipping lanes, its own financial systems, its own brutal form of corporate enforcement. The war in many ways professionalized the very thing it sought to destroy. And the chemistry, too, evolved under this pressure. When raw opium became difficult to transport, the process of refining it into heroin, a far more compact, potent and profitable product, became the standard. It was a simple matter of economics and risk. Why smuggle a bulky sack of dried latex when you can smuggle a small, innocuous-looking bag of powder with exponentially more value? The war against the plant became a war against the molecule, and the molecule, being smaller and more potent, was an even more difficult enemy to fight. For decades, this was the dominant strategy, a story told in black and white of good versus evil. But slowly, quietly, another perspective began to emerge. It began in the hospitals, in the addiction clinics, in the quiet conversations between doctors and patients. It was a perspective that didn't speak the language of war, but the language of medicine. It didn't talk about victory or defeat, but about health and harm. This was the philosophy of harm reduction. It was a profound and deeply compassionate shift. The core idea is simple, but revolutionary. If people are going to engage in risky behavior, and humans throughout history always have, can we find ways to make it less risky? Can we reduce the harm, even if we cannot entirely eliminate the behavior itself? It was a move away from judging the person, and a move toward treating the condition. The focus shifted from the moral failing of the user to the biochemical reality of addiction. This philosophy gave rise to some of the most important tools we now have. Things like needle exchange programs. A concept so simple yet so powerful. It doesn't stop addiction, but it dramatically stops the spread of diseases like HIV and hepatitis, which were being transmitted through shared needles. It's a simple act of pragmatic compassion. It is the recognition that a person suffering from addiction is still a person, deserving of life, deserving of a future free from a secondary fatal disease. And then there is the story of naloxone. It is, without exaggeration, one of the true miracles of modern pharmacology. We often think of miracles as grand, inexplicable events, but sometimes a miracle is just a molecule, exquisitely designed by clever, patient scientists to do one very specific job. To understand a naloxone, you have to picture what happens in an opioid overdose. The alkaloids from the poppy, or their synthetic cousins, find their way to the brainstem. There, they fit into specific locks, the mu-opioid receptors that control our most basic, unconscious function, the drive to breathe. The opioid molecule is a key that fits this lock perfectly, but when it turns, it gently, quietly turns the breathing off. The brain simply forgets. The body grows still. The overdose is often silent, a slow, peaceful fade into oblivion. Naloxone is another key. You could think of it as a master locksmith's key, designed with a deeper understanding of the lock itself. When it is introduced into the body, it races through the bloodstream to the brainstem. It has a much stronger affinity, a much more powerful attraction to that opioid receptor than the opioid itself. It arrives at the lock, and it doesn't just ask the other key to leave, it forcefully pushes it out. It shoves the opioid molecule aside, slots itself into the receptor, but it doesn't turn the lock off. It holds it in a neutral, open position. It effectively reverses the signal, and in doing so, it sends a powerful, urgent message back to the diaphragm: breathe. The effect is astonishing. A person who is blue, who is not breathing, who is minutes from death, can be brought back in seconds. A gasp, a sudden breath, a return to the world of the living. It is a true resurrection, engineered by biochemistry. It is not a cure for addiction, not at all. Its effects are temporary, but it is a cure for death in that moment. It provides a chance to try again tomorrow. Harm reduction is the principle of preserving that chance. Alongside this, new ways of treating the addiction itself began to emerge, moving beyond the simple, often brutal model of forced abstinence. Medications like methadone and buprenorphine were developed. These are, in themselves, opioids, which can seem counterintuitive, but they are a different kind of opioid, designed by chemists to be long-acting and to occupy the opioid receptors without producing the same intense, destructive euphoria. Think of it like this. Addiction creates a deep howling hunger in the brain's receptors. Going cold turkey is like trying to starve that hunger into submission, an agonizing process that very often fails. Methadone or buprenorphine are like a specially designed nutritional formula. They satisfy the receptor's craving, they quell the hunger, but they do it in a slow, stable, controlled way. They don't provide the chaotic rush of heroin, they provide a baseline of stability. This stability allows a person to break free from the desperate, all-consuming cycle of seeking and using. It allows them to hold down a job, to rebuild relationships, to engage in therapy. It gives them the solid ground they need to begin the long, difficult work of rebuilding a life. It is a form of medicine that acknowledges the deep biological changes that addiction creates in the brain. It doesn't demand that a person become a hero overnight. It offers them a tool, a support, a way to manage a chronic relapsing medical condition, no different from how we might manage diabetes or heart disease. And this brings us to the quiet, brightly lit laboratories of today. Here, another chapter in our relationship with the poppy is being written. This is the modern alchemist's quest, the search for the perfect painkiller. The dream is to finally separate the two faces of the poppy, to distill its gift, the relief of pain, entirely from its curse, the potential for addiction. For decades, we have used the alkaloids from the poppy as a starting point. Morphine is a magnificent but blunt instrument. It works wonders on pain, but it also acts on the reward centers of the brain, creating euphoria. It acts on the brainstem, suppressing breathing. It acts on the gut, causing constipation. It's like a master key that opens many doors in the palace of our nervous system, but we only really want it to open one, the door to pain relief. So the quest today is to design a more specific key. Scientists are mapping the intricate geography of our opioid receptors in 3 dimensions. There isn't just one kind of opioid receptor, there are several, primarily mu, kappa and delta. Each seems to play a different role. The mu receptor is the primary target for pain relief, but it's also the main culprit in addiction and respiratory depression. So the challenge is immense. Can we create a molecule that activates the mu receptor in a way that signals no pain, but not in a way that signals euphoria? This is called biased agonism, trying to coax the receptor into sending one message but not another. It's a bit like trying to ring a doorbell in a way that only the person in the living room can hear it, but not the dog in the kitchen. It is an incredibly subtle and complex task. Other researchers are exploring the other receptors. The kappa opioid receptors, for example, also seem to be involved in pain perception, but they don't produce the same addictive euphoria. In fact, activating them can sometimes produce the opposite effect, a feeling of unease called dysphoria. So, could a kappa agonist be a powerful non-addictive painkiller? The challenge there is to create one that doesn't cause unpleasant psychological side effects. Yet another avenue of exploration is to find a way to keep the painkiller out of the brain entirely. A great deal of pain originates not in the brain but in the peripheral nerves of the body, in a damaged knee, an inflamed gut, a surgical wound. What if we could design an opioid molecule that is physically too large or chemically configured in such a way that it cannot cross the blood-brain barrier? This is the formidable fortress that protects our central nervous system. A drug that couldn't enter the brain could, in theory, silence pain signals in the body without ever touching the brain centers responsible for addiction, reward, or breathing. It would be a painkiller that works only where the pain is. This is the frontier. It is slow, methodical, painstaking work. It is a world of computer modeling, of intricate chemical synthesis, of testing thousands upon thousands of candidate molecules. Each one is a tiny gamble, a hope for a future where we can offer a person in agony the profound relief that the poppy has promised for millennia. but without the terrible risk that has always accompanied it. A future where a doctor can prescribe a painkiller with the same confidence and peace of mind as they might prescribe an antibiotic. And so, our long journey with the poppy continues. It will not end with a declaration of victory in a war, nor with the invention of a single perfect drug. Our relationship with this plant is too old, too deep, too woven into the fabric of our own biology and our own psychology for it to have a simple conclusion. The poppy itself, Papaver somniferum, asks nothing of us. It simply is. It grows in the sun, its petals unfurling in the morning, their tissue paper delicacy belying the chemical power locked within its seed pod. It is a silent testament to nature's profound, patient, and sometimes terrifying ingenuity. It is a brilliant but amoral engineer, having designed a suite of molecules for its own survival that just happen to fit the most ancient locks in our own brains. It holds up a mirror to us. In our desire for its gifts, for the silencing of pain, for the escape from sorrow, for the quiet of a dream-filled sleep, we see the very essence of our own vulnerability. And in our struggles with it, in the stories of addiction, of exploitation, of war, we see our own capacity for obsession and self-destruction. The poppy is not good or evil, it is simply potent. It offers a key, and what we do with that key, whether we use it to unlock the gates of mercy or the prisons of addiction, that story is, and always has been, entirely our own. And now, as our story comes to its final, quiet close, let that thought settle, let the complexity rest. Picture that field one last time, not as a place of danger, but simply as a part of the vast, intricate tapestry of the natural world. A field of flowers, swaying gently in a quiet breeze, each one a small biological miracle, a factory of alkaloids, a vessel of history, a symbol of the eternal duality of things, of relief and risk, of beauty and of danger. There is a strange comfort in that complexity, a humility. It reminds us that we are a part of this natural world, not separate from it, that we are subject to its chemistry, its power, its beauty, and its peril. Let the image of the flowers fade now. Let it dissolve into the comfortable darkness behind your eyelids. There is nothing more to learn tonight, nothing more to analyze. The story is told. Your only task now is to let go, to feel the weight of your body sinking gently into the surface beneath you, to notice the soft, effortless rhythm of your own breath, in and out, a simple biological process, a quiet, reassuring engine of life, carrying on its work without any thought from you. Let each breath be a gentle wave, washing away the thoughts of the day, washing away the story we have just told, leaving only a sense of calm, a sense of peace. The world outside this room, with all its long and tangled histories, can wait until morning. For now there is only this space, this quiet, this gentle descent into rest. The poppy is the ancient flower of sleep, but you don't need its chemistry tonight. You have your own. The slow, natural release of melatonin, the gradual slowing of your heart rate, the intricate, beautiful biology of your own body, guiding you softly, safely into your own dreams. Sleep well.